What if Harry Potter awakened as the first necromancer in 1,000 years and built a dark army? A Savage Harry tale. Welcome to Savage Harry. Today's adventure. What if Harry Potter awakened as the first necromancer in 1,000 years and built a dark army? If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The Quidditch Fall and the Awakening. The rain came down in slate, and the castle did not move under it. By Friday morning, the corridors smelled of wet stone and torch smoke. Harry sat at the back of the defense classroom while Lupin returned essays and tried not to think about the boggart. He had not stood in front of it. He remembered Lupin's hand on his shoulder, the calm refusal. Not this week, Harry, not until you can hold the Patronus. There had been kindness in it. There had been something else as well. Lupin had looked at him the way a man looks at a piece of furniture that is heavier than it appears. What had risen in Harry's chest while the others laughed had not been embarrassment. It had been something colder, a registration. He was 13 years old, and 3 days earlier he had been told, without it being told to him, that his own fear was a kind of fear teachers preferred to keep outside their classrooms. He took his essay when it came. He went out. That night he sat on his bed with the curtains drawn and listened to Ron describe the spider in pinstriped trousers and laughed in the right places and did not look at the rain on the window. Hermione had won 6 points for nailing ridiculous on the first try. He had heard about that as well. He did not begrudge her. He did not begrudge anyone. He sat with the sound of laughter and the sound of rain and did not sleep well. He went down twice during the night. Once to the common room for water, once to the window on the second landing, the one with the casement that did not close right. The rain on the second landing was loud. The second time he stayed half an hour. He could not have said what he was watching for. The lake was a flat black under the storm. The forbidden forest was a darker shape behind. There was nothing visible at the tree line. There was nothing to be visible. He stood with his forehead against the cold pane and watched the wind moving in the rain. He went back up. He passed Neville coming the other way, also in pajamas, also unable to sleep. Neville did not see him. Neville never saw him at this hour. They both kept to the rule. He lay down. He did not close his eyes. He had gone to Lupin's office on the Wednesday. He had asked in the indirect way 13-year-olds asked whether he could be taught the Patronus before the Hufflepuff match. He had meant before another fall like the one on the train. Lupin had understood. Lupin had said number. Lupin had said it kindly. Lupin had said the Patronus was not a charm a boy of his age would manage in 3 days, however much fear was used as fuel. Lupin had offered private lessons after the holidays. Harry had thanked him. He had walked out into the corridor and stood for some time with his back against the stone, and what had risen in his chest had not been disappointment. It had been a registration. He had been told no by a man who liked him on the question of whether he might be given a defense against the only thing in the castle that frightened him. The reasoning was sound. The kindness was real. Both of those facts had sat in his chest like instruments laid on a tray, and the tray had been very level. He had not on the Wednesday called the levelness a thing. He had thought of it as tiredness. On the Friday night, in his bed in the dormitory, he thought of it as something else. He did not yet have a name. He let it not have a name. He did not sleep until the small hours. By Saturday the storm had thickened. The sky over the Quidditch pitch was the color of an old bruise. The wind shoved through the stands so hard the banners cracked like sails. Madame Hooch was shouting into the wind for the captains. Cedric Diggory's hair was already plastered to his forehead. Wood stood gripping his broom in both hands and trying to look unbothered, which Wood did on principle, the way other people breathed. Hermione caught Harry in the corridor before he left the tower. She had her hood pulled up against the wind that was getting in through the cloister. "It's mad," she said. "Wood should call it." "Anyone could see he won't call it." She caught his sleeve. "Be careful." He nodded. There was nothing else to say. He pulled his goggles down. They fogged immediately. He went down through the castle and out across the grass under the storm. The changing room was loud with Wood in his speech. Harry did not register most of it. He registered enough. He registered Fred and George holding their faces straight. He registered Angelina watching Wood with the patience of someone who has memorized the rhythm of a clock. He registered Ron in the stand somewhere above and Hermione and Hagrid in his huge coat. Wood said, "Lads, lasses, this is the match. This is the match in this storm because the storm is the match. Diggory will fly conservative. Conservative loses in a storm. We fly the storm." Fred said, "We fly the storm." George said, "We are the storm." Wood said, "Stop it, you two." He looked at Harry last. Wood's eyes had a kind of grief in them that did not match the moment. Harry recognized the grief. It was the grief of a captain who had calculated somewhere in him that the conditions did not favor his seeker. Wood was not a man who said such things aloud. "Harry, the snitch will be hard. Find it. Get out of the storm." "Yes." Wood nodded. He turned away to the rest. He did not look at Harry again. They went out. He went up through the rain and lost the others inside 30 seconds. The pitch was a sheet of gray. Visibility was a length and a half of broomstick. He could hear the crowd as a smear. He could hear distantly Lee Jordan's voice on the loudspeaker, scrubbed of all words. Cedric was a shape on his left, then not. The snitch did not show. For a stretch of minutes with no inside texture, he flew in circles and saw nothing. Then the cold came. It did not come from the storm. The storm was already cold. This was a different cold. It came up his arms from the inside. It came up the chest into the throat. He had felt it once before on the Hogwarts Express, and he had not understood then what it was. He understood now in the sense that the body understands before the mind has been told. He looked down. There were figures on the pitch. He could not at first count them. They were standing very still, and they were not wearing the colors of houses. Their cloaks moved against the wind, not with it. He thought 12, he thought then more. The match dropped out of him. He could hear something, a voice, a woman's voice, a long way off and very close at once. He could not understand the words. He understood the shape of them. They were words he had heard once before in a room he did not remember. His grip on the broom loosened, and the broom did not save him. He felt the wind change as he came off it. The fall was not long. He was thinking on the way down that it was strange how short it was. He was thinking how strange that the world spent so much time arranging itself into towers and pitches and broomsticks and storms when this was the actual size of falling, a breath, an inhalation, an impact. He thought, "I am going to die." He thought it without alarm. The pitch came up. He did not feel the bone break. He felt the air go. He felt the cold from the figures arrive in his chest at the same instant his back hit the grass. And then he felt something else. Inside him, something opened. Something turned over. It was not pain. It was the opposite of pain. Something that had been folded for a very long time was unfolding, and the edges of it were cold and very precise. He was lying on the pitch in the rain, and he could see inside his own skull a doorway. Behind the doorway was a long room with no lamp in it. At the back of the long room something was lifting its head. He could not hear the crowd anymore. He could hear other voices. They were not speaking English. He understood them anyway. They were not addressing him. They were addressing the thing in the long room. They were addressing him as if his name had been known to them for a very long time and they had been waiting. The rain stopped or stopped mattering. Above him, where the sky should have been, there were faces. Some of them he knew. Some of them were translucent. Some of them were not. He understood before he understood anything else that the gap between those two states had just closed. Then a hand the color of bone touched his shoulder, and he stopped seeing the pitch. Later, in the manner of things that happened during a fall, he would learn what had happened above him. He would learn that McGonagall had been on her feet before he reached the ground. He would learn that she had crossed half the pitch by the time his back hit the grass, and that her wand had been out, and that she had cast a cushioning charm that arrived a half-second too late. He would learn that Hagrid had come over the touchline at a flat run, and that Dumbledore had stood up from his seat in the staff box and lifted his wand without speaking, and that every Dementor on the field had been driven across the boundary in a wave of silver before any teacher had got out a phrase. He would learn that the silver shape Dumbledore had cast had been seen by Madame Pomfrey afterward as taller than the goal posts. He would learn that Wood had not screamed. Wood had stood in his stirrups and watched. Wood would not say, ever, what he had been thinking. He would learn that the crowd had stopped, all of it, in the way crowds stop when the thing they have come to watch has been replaced. He would learn none of these things from anyone's mouth in the days following. The dead in the corridor would tell him. The dead missed very little. He woke in white. He did not at first remember the fall. He remembered the cold. He remembered the doorway. He remembered the room behind the doorway and the head lifting at the back of it. His arm was in a splint. His ribs were bound. Madame Pomfrey was somewhere out of sight, banging a cabinet door. The hospital wing's high windows showed a different kind of weather, gray and still. The storm finished. He blinked at the ceiling. He was about to look for the others when something moved at the foot of his bed. Sir Nicholas was standing there. That in itself would not have been strange. The Gryffindor ghost made the rounds of the hospital wing as a matter of courtesy. He had visited Harry once before in second year when Harry had been frozen in a corridor. The visit had been delicate. Sir Nicholas had been delicate. What was strange was that Sir Nicholas was solid. He was not transparent. He was not silvered. His doublet was the color of pomegranate. His ruff was white. The wound on his neck was a clean, dark line that did not seep. He was looking at Harry with the careful attention of a man being introduced to a stranger of higher rank than he had expected. "Mr. Potter," he said. His voice was a voice. It had texture. It had a slight rasp at the edges, the precise warmth of any spoken thing. It was not echoing. It was not coming as ghost voices usually came from a slightly different room. Harry tried to speak. His mouth was dry. Sir Nicholas inclined his head. "I see," he said softly, "that you can see me." Harry's first instinct, trained by a year and a half of Hogwarts, was to say of course he could see him. Everyone could see him. He did not say it. Something in the way Sir Nicholas had said the verb held him. Harry said yes. Ah, said the ghost. The wing was quiet. Madame Pomfrey was somewhere down the corridor, scolding a portrait. Sir Nicholas came round the side of the bed. He did not float, he walked. His footfalls made no sound on the boards, which Harry found, in retrospect, the only ghost-like thing about him. I felt you, Sir Nicholas said, on the pitch. We all felt you. The friar called it from the kitchens. The Baron came up from the dungeons. Even she came down from her tower. We had not been called like that since I was a boy. Harry tried to find his voice, called, spoken to, as if by a name we recognized, without your knowing the name, of course. But that, he gestured at Harry's chest, knew it. He sat with great courtesy on the edge of the bed. The mattress did not shift. Mr. Potter, Sir Nicholas said, may I ask you something? Harry nodded. Can you hear just now the dead in the corridor? Harry listened. He could. He had not noticed. The sound had been weaving itself into the room since he woke. Footsteps, murmurs, a breath of laughter from somewhere far below. A child's voice on a stair that did not lead, that Harry knew of, to any room. He had heard them and had assumed they were the living. He looked at Sir Nicholas. Sir Nicholas, who had been dead more than 500 years, watched him quietly. Yes, Harry said. The ghost, Harry was not sure he could keep calling him that, closed his eyes for a moment and inclined his head again, in the gesture men use when something they had hoped for has arrived. Then we have met properly, he said, at last. There was a sound that was not a sound exactly, but a movement of the room. The lamps in their iron brackets dipped, none of them quite out. The temperature dropped a degree. A woman stepped out of the wall. She was thin. Her hair was the color of ash and unbound. Her gown was the deep gray of a thunderhead. She was not translucent either. She was, if anything, more solid than Sir Nicholas, more sharp at the edges, as if she had been waiting longer. She looked at Harry. My lord, she said. The words were so quiet he almost did not catch them. Sir Nicholas rose at once. Helena, he said, forgive me. She did not look at him. She came to the side of the bed. Her bare feet did not touch the boards. Her eyes were dark. They were not human eyes. They were a memory of human eyes with the warmth annealed out. Do you know what you are? She said. Harry did not. You will. She put her hand, the color of old paper, on the back of his hand. He did not feel cold. He felt briefly a pressure, the pressure of being acknowledged. When you know, she said, find me. She stepped back into the wall. Sir Nicholas stood several seconds in the place she had been. Then he turned to Harry, bowed, the deep formal bow of a courtier, and was gone before he was through the door. Madame Pomfrey came in carrying a tray. You are awake, she said, with the brisk disapproval she reserved for her preferred patients. 3 days, Mr. Potter. Concussion, a clean break in the radius, 2 ribs, and you did not crack the skull, which I take as a personal insult to my pessimism. Drink this. Harry drank. He did not speak about Sir Nicholas. He did not speak about Helena. The headmaster has been sitting up half the night, Madame Pomfrey said. He was here when I last looked in. He has gone to take a bath. He will return. How long was I out? 3 days, then 20 minutes. She paused over the tray. Your friends are camped in the hall outside. I have told them to wait until you have your color back. You have your color. Miss Granger first. The Weasley boy will wait on the grounds that he has been threatening my portraits with profanities. She turned to go. Madame Pomfrey, Harry said. What happened to my broom? He had asked it because he could not ask what had happened to him. Pomfrey's face softened. It was the briefest softening. He noted it. Mr. Potter, she said, your broom went into the whooping willow. He understood that the broom was gone. Thank you, he said. She went out. He sat in the white sheets and listened to the hospital wing breathe. Somewhere in the castle, a great many people who were not alive were going about a great many things, and he could hear all of them as if they were in the next bed. He could hear, in a way he could not have described, that several of them were turning their attention toward this room. He thought about telling Dumbledore. He thought about telling Hermione. He thought about telling Ron. He thought instead about Sir Nicholas's face when Helena had said, my lord. He thought about the long room behind the door inside his own skull and the thing at the back of it that had finally lifted its head. He chose, lying there, what was now required of him. He did not call it a decision. He understood it as a fact that had become available. He would say nothing. He would learn what he was. He would do it under his own roof and his own hand and his own name, and he would not ask permission of anyone alive. He breathed out. The room did not change. The cold did not deepen. He felt in his own chest only a very precise stillness, like a calibrated instrument finding its zero. Hermione came in carrying books. She did not say hello. She put the books on the table by his bed and looked at him for several seconds with her arms folded and her jaw set, which was how she expressed relief. Idiot, she said. Hello. She sat down. You scared us. You scared Wood. You scared Lupin. You scared Harry. McGonagall went into her office and did not come out for an hour. McGonagall. I know what McGonagall is, right, yes, that. She watched him. She started to talk. She talked about the Dementors and what Lupin had said and what Dumbledore had said and what Fudge had said and what the Daily Prophet had said. He let her finish. Behind her in the doorway, Sir Nicholas was waiting. He had folded his arms. The wound on his neck was clean. Harry let his eyes hold Hermione's face. What happened on the pitch? She said. I fell. I know you fell. Before that, your face went, Harry. It was not a normal fall. McGonagall said it was as if something had pulled you off the broom. Something did. The Dementors, yes. She watched him for a long moment. All right, she said. All right, we can talk later. You need rest. Ron is going to come in and shout at you, and then I'm going to come back in and shout at you, and then we are going to plan how you become unbeatable against those things, because I have been in the library and I have a list of texts. Hermione. What? He smiled. It was an ordinary smile. He found it without difficulty. He noted, with the quiet curiosity of a man checking that an instrument has not been knocked out of calibration, that he could find such a smile without effort. Thank you for the books, he said. She left, satisfied. Sir Nicholas did not leave the doorway. Ron came in. Ron shouted as advertised. Ron called him a great Burke and informed him that Oliver Wood had stood in the showers for an hour with his clothes on. Ron sat on the bed, did not move, ate one of Mrs. Weasley's biscuits, offered Harry one. Harry took it. He told Ron about his broom. He did not tell Ron about the doorway. Ron left. Lupin came in next. He came in alone. He looked tired in the way Lupin always looked tired. He did not sit. He stood at the foot of the bed with his hands in the pockets of his shabby robe and looked at Harry as if Harry were a problem he had already failed to solve. I am sorry, Lupin said. For what? I should have taught you the Patronus before today. Harry watched him. It would not have helped, he said. Lupin's eyes moved to his face. Why, there were 12 of them. Lupin closed his eyes briefly. More than 12, in fact, he said. Yes, I know, I am still sorry. Will you teach me now? Yes, good. Lupin looked at him another moment. You are very calm, Harry, he said. I am tired. Yes. Lupin watched him. There was in the watching something that was not pity. It was not suspicion either. It was the attention of a man who has heard a wrong note in a familiar song and is trying to decide whether the note was in the song or in his ear. Rest, he said. He went. Sir Nicholas, in the doorway, inclined his head as Lupin passed. Lupin did not see him. Hagrid came after Lupin. Hagrid filled the doorway. Hagrid's beard was wet. He had a bunch of fennel in one fist that he had cut for some reason of his own and forgotten to give to whoever it was for. Harry, he said. Hagrid. Hagrid sat. The chair complained. He looked at Harry. He looked at Harry's splint. He looked at Harry's ribs. He looked at the bandage on the side of Harry's head. He set the fennel down on the table, ate one of Mrs. Weasley's biscuits without asking, and said nothing for a long time. I saw M, he said finally, on the field. Yes, Dumbledore he saw to M, but they shouldn't have got there. Number. Hagrid's huge hand reached out and rested on Harry's good arm. His hand was hot. His hand was the only hot thing in the wing. You all right? Harry considered the question. I will be, he said. Hagrid nodded slowly. Hagrid was not a man who lied about feeling things, and he was not a man who pressed. He had brought himself to the hospital wing because Harry had hit the ground and because Hagrid loved him, and he had no other agenda. Harry, in the White Room with the dead in the doorway, sat with that fact and let it warm him as much as it could. I'll go, Hagrid said after a while. Pomfrey-esque giving me looks. I just wanted, be well. He went. The Bloody Baron in the corridor did not bow as Hagrid passed. Harry was glad of that. Dumbledore came in last. He came in alone. He did not speak at first. He sat down in the chair Hermione had used. He put his hands together in his lap and looked at Harry over his half-moon spectacles with the expression of a man weighing not a child but a question. Harry felt the weighing. He let his face be the face he had practiced all morning. He let his shoulders be the shoulders of a boy who had been knocked off a broom and who was glad to be alive. Sir, Harry. The headmaster's eyes moved, very briefly, around the room. They paused at the doorway. They paused at the wall the Grey Lady had stepped out of. They paused at the foot of the bed where Sir Nicholas had stood. They came back to Harry's face. How are you? Dumbledore said. Sore. Yes. A pause. The pause was longer than necessary. You hit the ground hard, Dumbledore said. Yes, sir. The Dementors had no business at a Quidditch match. I have spoken to the Ministry. They will not be permitted near the school again, I give you my word. Harry nodded. Dumbledore's eyes did not leave his face. Harry, did anything occur to you during the fall that you found? He paused, choosing, unfamiliar. Harry held the old man's gaze. In the corridor, Sir Nicholas had folded his arms and was watching Harry the way a man watches a duelist. It was very cold, sir, Harry said, and then I was on the ground. Dumbledore looked at him. It was a long look. There was, inside it, no anger. There was inside it nothing Harry could identify as suspicion. There was only the patience of a man who had known 1,000 boys and 100 secrets, and who was prepared to wait until a particular truth presented itself for an introduction. "Very well," Dumbledore said at last. He rose. He paused at the foot of the bed. He looked at the floor for a moment in the place where Helena's bare feet had not touched, and Harry felt briefly that the room was holding its breath. "Rest, Harry," he said. "Yes, sir." He left. The wing emptied of the living. It did not empty of the dead. Harry lay back against the pillow. He let his arm and his ribs and his head be the sore-but-mending things they were, and let the rest of him be what it had become. Around the doorway 3 figures stood. Sir Nicholas. The fat friar, his rope belt knotted, his face composed. A man Harry knew by reputation only. The bloody Baron in the silvered chains, the spatter at his throat that did not move. The Baron was looking at him. The Baron did not bow. The Baron said, "Boy." Harry met his eyes. "Sir, you will come to me," the Baron said. "Not now, when you have read enough that you do not embarrass yourself. In the 3rd week of term, the dungeon corridor under the Slytherin entrance. After moonrise, you will come alone." "Yes, sir." "You will bring a question." "Yes, sir." "Do not bring 2. He inclined his head, not a bow, in acknowledgement, and was gone. The friar stepped forward. He had a kindly face. He had the kindly face of a man who had been kindly for 900 years. "My dear," he said, "you will be hungry tonight. I have asked the kitchens. They will send up something light. Do not eat the cabbage." "Thank you." "Helena," the friar said almost to himself, "has not come down from her tower in 200 years. He bowed and was gone. Sir Nicholas remained. "Tomorrow," he said, "the library, the restricted section, have your father's cloak." Harry's pulse did not jump. He noted that it did not jump. "Yes, sir." "And Mr. Potter?" "Yes. Take care to learn before you act. There are old things in this castle and old things outside it that will mistake what you can do now for what you may do later. The mistake will not be entirely yours, but it will be lethal." "Yes." Sir Nicholas bowed. He went. Harry sat in the white room and let the candle in the bracket by the door do its small work. He listened to the corridor. The corridor was quieter now. The dead, having paid their first respects, had withdrawn to whatever business the dead had. He turned his hand over on the sheet and looked at it. Beneath the skin, where there was no light to show it, he felt something move. Not blood, not magic exactly. A pressure he had not had before, a reservoir. He had the sense that he could not now close it. He sat for a long time with his hand turned upward in his lap. Outside, through the high windows, the dawn was the color of old iron. He could hear distinctly the slow ringing of a bell that the Cathedral of Hogwarts had not used since the Founder's time. It was not ringing for him. It was ringing because he could hear it. He listened until it stopped. Then he got up. He dressed himself slowly because of the ribs. He stood at the window. In the courtyard below, 3 figures were standing in the rain. They were not students. They were not wearing the cloaks of the living. They were looking up at his window. He raised one hand. They bowed. He drew the curtain. He sat on the edge of the bed and considered, with the precision of a man laying out instruments for a procedure, what he now knew. He knew the Dementors had brought it on. He knew the cold of them had reached past his body into a place his body had been keeping locked. He knew the lock had been older than him, older than his father, older than this castle. He knew the door behind the lock had a long room behind it, and the long room had something in it, and the thing in the room had lifted its head when his back hit the grass. He knew the dead had a name for what he was, and the name was not a thing they would say aloud. He knew Dumbledore had asked. He knew he had lied. He sat with that fact and waited for the part of him that should have flinched. The part of him that should have flinched did not flinch. It was not callousness, it was a shape. It was the shape of the new instrument. The instrument's calibration did not include flinching at this question. It included other things. He would discover them in time. He stood up. He went to the window again. The figures were gone. The courtyard had its ordinary morning, the cold paving, the puddles, a black cat picking its way along the cloister. He felt behind his eyes the long room. He breathed in. He breathed out. He spoke aloud in the empty hospital wing, the one word that came up out of him without his choosing it, which was the only true thing he had said since the pitch. "Begin," he said. The candle by the door, which had not been touched, went out without a sound. He stood in the gray light. He waited until he was sure he was steady on his feet. Then he turned, went back to the bed, lay down with his face to the window, and gave himself permission to sleep. He slept until midday. When he woke, he was hungry. The friar had been correct. The tray that came up at noon had bread and broth and a thin slice of meat and no cabbage. He ate it all. He had not yet seen his parents again. He did not look for them in the empty room. He understood, without needing it explained, that the dead would come to him in their order. He had 3 weeks until the Baron expected him in the dungeon corridor. He had one night when his ribs were sound enough to keep his appointment with Sir Nicholas in the restricted section. He had a lifetime to learn what he was. He turned his face to the window again and watched the iron light over the lake and felt, for the first time since the changing room, that he was sitting inside the right shape of himself. The shape was cold, the shape was certain. The shape did not anywhere in it contain a flinch. He slept again. This time he dreamed properly. He dreamed of his parents, both of them solid, sitting at the foot of the bed. Lily was wearing a pale gray shirt. James had a hand on her shoulder. Their eyes were the kind of eyes the gray lady had had, with the warmth taken out, and they were the eyes of people who knew exactly who he was. Lily said, "You will have to learn quickly, my love." James said, "We are sorry, we were not given enough time to leave the part of this in you that would have made it easier." Lily said, "It would not have been easier." James said, "Number it would not." They watched him. He said, "Are you really here?" Lily said, "We are as here as you need us to be. Tonight that is enough, there will be other nights." James said, "Sleep. The hospital wing is not the place to begin. The library is. After moonrise, the third night you can stand. The cloak." Lily said, "And Harry, trust the Baron's pride. He will not lie to you for sport. He will lie to you for instruction. They are not the same." Harry said, "Yes." They sat at the foot of the bed and did not vanish until he was deep enough not to see them. He slept past noon. When Pomfrey came to wake him for the second meal, he sat up against the pillow and asked her, in a voice that surprised her with its courtesy, when she thought he would be well enough to be released. "Wednesday," she said. "Thank you." She watched him for a moment. "You are not the same boy who came in here on Saturday afternoon, Mr. Potter." I hit my head. "You did." She held his eye a second longer than was usual and then went out and did not come back until evening. He sat in the white room and looked at his hand, palm up on the sheet. He listened to the corridor. In the corridor, a woman's voice he had not heard since the train was singing very softly, what might have been a lullaby in a language he understood now in the way he understood the others, not by translation but by recognition. He let her sing. He waited for Wednesday. On the Sunday evening they let Ginny in. She had brought a get-well card the others had drawn on. She sat on the edge of the bed for 10 minutes and did not say much. She had been 12 years old in the chamber, and Harry recognized, looking at her, that she was not surprised by the quietness of his face. She did not ask what had been on the pitch. She did not ask what he had seen. When she stood to go, she looked at him a beat longer than the card warranted. "You're different," she said. He did not deny it. "Yeah, good kind of different." He considered the question with the care of a man who had been asked something serious. "I don't know yet." "All right," she said. "Tell me when you do." She left. On the Monday they let in Wood, who had been forbidden by Pomfrey on the grounds of cardiovascular strain. Wood stood at the foot of the bed in his Quidditch robes, with his hair flat against his head and his eyes red, and looked at Harry for some seconds. "They couldn't have done anything against 12, Wood said. "Number, I should have called it. I would not have let you call it." "I know." He stood a moment longer. "You'll fly again." "Yes, all right." He went. On the Tuesday morning, Snape passed Harry in the corridor outside the hospital wing. Pomfrey had let him sit up in the alcove by the window for an hour with a blanket and stopped and looked at him. Snape did not approach. Snape did not speak. Snape stood in the corridor with his black eyes on Harry's face and read him the way men read a sentence in a language they had hoped never to find on a page again. Harry looked back. He did not lower his eyes. He did not present his eyes either. He gave Snape the precise, polite attention a student gave a professor in passing, with nothing else in it. Snape's jaw worked once. Snape walked on. Harry felt after the print of that gaze the way a man feels the print of a knife laid briefly against skin. He did not then understand what Snape had read. He would understand later. Snape had been a young man among Death Eaters once and had heard in their company certain old talk about certain old bloodlines and certain old gifts. Snape was not a man who forgot talk. Snape had not been certain. Snape was now uncertain in a sharper direction. Harry would manage Snape later. On the Tuesday evening the Baron came again. He did not enter the wing. He stood in the corridor outside and waited until Harry could see him. "Wednesday," he said. "Yes, you will sleep tonight, not read." "Yes, some of the books in the second alcove are bound in skin. The skin is the skin of a man who was once a wizard, who chose, at the end, to be ink. You will recognize the binding by feel. You will be tempted to read those before the others. Do not, they are for after." "Yes, do you have a question?" Harry waited until he was certain of his question. "What am I, sir?" The Baron's silvered face did not change. "That," he said, "is the question I would have asked you to ask. You will not get the answer from me. You will get it from the books. Then you will come to me, and I will tell you whether you have read correctly." He inclined his head and was gone. Wednesday morning came in gray. Pomfrey released him after a final inspection and a final warning and a final assurance that she was not pleased with the speed of his recovery and intended to write Dumbledore about it. He thanked her gravely. He took his things in a bundle under his good arm and walked out into the corridor. The corridor was full. The living were going to lessons. The dead were also in motion. He saw, walking the same corridor as a stream of fourth years going to Transfiguration, two women he did not know in the dress of 3 centuries earlier, conversing as they walked. He saw a boy of perhaps 8 years old carrying, with great care, a wooden top. He saw at a junction a tall thin man in scholar's robes who paused and looked at him and bowed before continuing. The living did not see any of this. The living walked through the dead without flinching, because nothing in their senses had ever told them otherwise. He walked with them. He found in the walking that the new sight did not interfere with the old. He could see Hermione coming round the corner ahead with her bag of books over her shoulder, and he could see, 2 paces behind her, a girl of about her age in a Ravenclaw scarf 200 years out of style, and the girl looked at him and smiled and was gone before Hermione reached him. "You're up," Hermione said. "I am." Pomfrey said tomorrow. She changed her mind. "You bullied her." "I did not." "You did. Your voice does that thing now." He looked at her. "What thing?" She paused, she frowned, she watched his face for a moment with the attention she usually gave to a difficult arithmancy line. "Nothing," she said. "Come on, charms first. Flitwick will be sorry to see you." They walked. He noticed her noticing him. He let her notice him. He kept his pace and his voice and his ordinary inattention to the corridor on the side where the dead were walking. He let nothing show. At charms he sat by Ron and Hermione, and did cheering charms with reasonable competence and was not asked about the fall. Flitwick looked at him once in the way of a small man who had taught 1,000 boys and said nothing. At lunch he ate. The food tasted of food. The great hall held its usual din, and behind the din, very faint, the murmur of the corridors of the dead beyond the staff table. He could pick out the friar at the Hufflepuff table laughing at something he himself had said 300 years before. He could pick out, at the Slytherin end, the Baron who did not look at him. In the afternoon Lupin's class was the Patronus, as promised. He could not cast it. None of them could cast it. They got the wand movement and the incantation and a thin silvery vapor out of lavender brown and nothing else. Lupin praised the vapor. Lupin watched Harry when Harry tried. Harry tried in earnest. He thought of his parents, both of them solid, sitting at the foot of his bed, and he produced, on the 3rd attempt, a brief silvery shape that was not quite an animal, that hovered for a beat and then went out. Lupin's face did not change. "That was very good, Harry," he said. "We will continue privately." "Thank you, sir." After class, he stayed back to take down a book Lupin offered. The book was a slim text on the history of Patronus charms. He put it under his arm. He turned to go. "Harry, sir." Lupin was at his desk. He was not looking up. "If anything has changed for you," Lupin said, "and you wish to talk about it, my door is open." Harry stood in the doorway and considered the offer. It was an honest offer. He noted the honesty. "Thank you, sir," he said. "It hasn't." He went out. In the corridor outside Lupin's office, he stopped for a moment and stood by the window. The lake was a flat gray. The forbidden forest was a darker shape behind. There was nothing visible at the tree line. He could feel now that something was visible at the tree line. He could not see it. He could feel it. He understood with the certainty he had carried since the pitch that what was at the tree line was waiting. It was not waiting for him to come tonight. It was waiting for him to know he could come. He turned from the window. He went down to the tower to fetch the cloak. He did it quietly. Ron was at dinner. Hermione was at dinner. The dormitory was empty. He took the cloak from his trunk and folded it small and put it inside his school robes against his ribs, where it weighed almost nothing. He went down to dinner. He ate slowly with the others. He laughed once at one of Fred's jokes. He answered Hermione's questions about charms. He waited for the hall to thin. He waited for the moon. When the moon was over the astronomy tower, he excused himself, said something about needing a book, walked the corridors with the casual, unhurried pace of a boy who had no business beyond a book. The dead were in motion. They were sparse at this hour. The few he saw inclined their heads. He came to the library. The library was closed. The library was, for the next hour, the library of the restricted section. He stood in the doorway with the cloak in his hand. He felt behind his eyes the long room. He felt in his chest the reservoir. He felt very precisely nothing else. He slipped the cloak over his head and went in. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, Antioch PVRLLS gift confirmed. The restricted section was arranged, Harry discovered on the first night, not for readers. It was arranged for librarians. The classification was idiosyncratic. The books were not in alphabetical order, nor in chronological order, nor in subject order, nor in any single order at all. They were in 5 overlapping orders, each used at different periods by different librarians, each abandoned without anyone removing the labels of the previous system. A book on death magic might be on the 4th shelf in the 2nd alcove, because Madame Pince had filed it there in 1979, or it might be in the corner of the 3rd alcove, because a librarian in 1812 had decided to keep all bindings of vellum together, or it might be lying flat on top of the others on the 7th shelf, because a librarian in 1640 had been afraid of its spine. He worked this out in 40 minutes. He then reclassified in his head the contents of the alcove he wanted, using a system that was internally consistent and that he could navigate quickly. He did not write the system down, he committed it to memory. He estimated on the first night that he would lose 3 to 4 hours per visit to navigation, and that this loss could be reduced to under 20 minutes by visit 4. He gave himself 12 visits. He had between now and the end of term to use them. He read by wandlight under the cloak. The cloak was not designed for sustained reading. The wandlight bled out of it in a hazy halo if held at arm's length. He learned on the first night to hold the wand against his chest with the light pointing upward into the inside of the hood, which made his face faintly luminous from below and would have alarmed anyone who saw him, but would also have alarmed anyone who saw a teenage boy in a library after curfew, and the cloak prevented both. He began with the broad questions. He defined them first in a list mentally, the way he had been taught in Hermione's company without meaning to be taught it. 1. What had happened to him on the pitch? 2. What category of magic the dead sight belonged to? 3. Whether there was a known name for it? 4. Whether others had had it before? 5. Whether the others had been recorded? 6. Whether the recordings included names? 7. Whether the names included his. The 7th question was a joke he made to himself in the silence of the alcove. He noticed that he had made it. He noticed that he found it slightly amusing. He noticed further that the amusement was the first he had registered since the pitch, and that he registered it without surprise, as if his sense of humor, like his pulse, had returned to him after a brief absence. He filed the joke under things he was still capable of. He read. The restricted section had 2 kinds of book on death. The first kind were diagnostic, descriptions of curses that killed, of poisons that killed, of objects that killed. The killing curse occupied 4 shelves. The literature on Inferi occupied a single shelf, mostly the same 2 paragraphs reprinted in slightly different anthologies. The literature on the Veil occupied a single book, very thin, that had been signed out twice in the last 400 years, both times by unspeakables and both times returned with the bookmark in different places, suggesting that no one had ever read it through. The second kind were prescriptive, how, where, and under what conditions a wizard might lawfully or unlawfully employ death magic. These were sparser. The wizarding world had broadly not wished such books to be written. The ones that existed were old and were written in a tone that suggested the authors had not expected to be read in good faith. Harry took notes on neither. He read the first kind to learn what was in his world and the second kind to learn what was not in his world, and the gap between the two, the silence in the middle, the absence around which the others arranged themselves, was where he would find what he was. He found it on the 3rd night. It was in a book called Lineages and Talents by a wizard named Caspar Mowbray, published in 1602 and not reissued. Mowbray had been a genealogist with an obsession with what he called dormant capacities, magical traits that ran in bloodlines and that surfaced once every several generations, often skipping centuries, sometimes never resurfacing at all. Mowbray had been considered eccentric in his own time. He had died poor. Mowbray had a chapter on the Peveril line. Harry read it standing up. Mowbray's argument in plain summary was as follows. There had been in the 11th century 3 brothers Peveril. They had been distinguished wizards. They had been particularly distinguished in 3 different talents which Mowbray classified, using his own taxonomy, as the talent of the wand, the talent of the stone, and the talent of the cloak. Mowbray did not name the brothers. The folktale of the 3 brothers was not, in 1602, the folktale it would become. Mowbray treated them as historical figures. He named instead their talents. The talent of the wand was the eldest brother S. Mowbray identified it as a capacity for what he called dominium mortis, dominion over death. He distinguished it carefully from the killing arts of dark wizards in general, which were, in his view, merely violent. The talent of the wand was different. It was the ability to command what was dead. It was the original death magic from which, Mowbray argued, the various lesser branches, inferi, ghosts, wraiths, liches, the whole genus had descended as their practitioners. Powers had degenerated over the centuries. It was, in his thesis, the trunk of the tree. Mowbray noted in a footnote that the eldest brother had died in his bed of a slit throat at the hand of a man who coveted his wand, and that with him had died the only documented case of the full talent. He did not say the talent itself had died. He said it had become dormant. He went on in the next paragraph to explain what he meant by dormant. The eldest brother had children, Mowbray wrote. The children had children. The talent did not surface in any of them. It did not surface in their children either, nor in their grandchildren. It receded into the bloodline and did not present. Mowbray, working from the records of the Wisengamot and from the parish books of 3 counties, traced the eldest Peveril brothers' descendants for 6 generations, then lost the line in the records of the Black Death. He hypothesized, however, that the line had continued. He hypothesized that the talent had continued with it. He hypothesized that a talent of this kind, having found nowhere to surface in the placid lives of country wizards and merchants, would wait. It would wait, he wrote, for an event of sufficient violence and intimacy to wake it. He proposed 3 conditions under which such waking might occur. He proposed near death by death magic. He proposed exposure to the presence of beings whose nature was death, wraiths, dementors, the rare encounter with a lick. He proposed the conjunction of both. He noted that no waking had been recorded since the eldest brother's death. He noted that this was consistent with his thesis. He noted that the wizard who underwent such a waking, should one ever occur, would be the first wizard with the full talent in 1,000 years. He underlined the word first. Harry stood under the cloak in the alcove and read the underlined word and thought about the cold on the pitch and thought about the figures at the boundary and thought about the door inside his skull. He read the chapter again. He read the chapter a 3rd time. He took it down to the carrel by the window, sat down on the floor with the book in his lap, and stared at the underlined word for what he estimated afterward to be 12 minutes. He did not feel anything large. He felt, instead, something very small. He felt the click of a key turning in a lock he had not known he had been carrying. He thought in the order in which it presented itself. I am descended from the eldest brother. The cloak in my trunk is from the 3rd brother. The line I belong to has gathered, by chance or otherwise, more than one Peveril legacy. The eldest brother's gift has waked in me. The waking occurred under the conditions Mowbray predicted. I am, by Mowbray's measure, the first wizard in 1,000 years with the full talent. He thought after that, I have to make sure Mowbray is right. This was the part of his mind that had grown up next to Hermione's, and he honored it. He did not act on the conclusion before he had tested it. He spent the next 3 nights testing Mowbray. He looked up Mowbray's sources. Mowbray cited 4 chronicles, 2 parish books, 1 Wisengamot ledger, and 3 private journals. 2 of the chronicles were in the restricted section. The Wisengamot ledger was not, but a contemporary reproduction had been bound into a 19th century compilation that was. The parish books were Muggle records and were not available, but Mowbray's quotations were extensive and could be cross-checked against later genealogical works. He read them all. Mowbray was, on every checkable point, correct. He had been a careful man. He had been eccentric in his conclusions and rigorous in his evidence. The Peveril genealogy he laid out was supported. The hypothesis of dormancy was novel but not contradicted by anything in the literature. The conditions for waking he proposed were consistent with the lone analogous case, a French witch in the 12th century who had presented partial death sight after a near-death experience and who had been killed before her capacities developed. Harry filed her death under confirmed. He looked next for any other case of a full talent waking after the eldest brother's death. He found none. He looked next for any case of a wizard claiming the talent in error. He found 3. All 3 had been ordinary necromancers, wizards who could raise weak inferi, command minor ghosts, do small business with the dead, who had been mistakenly grouped with the talent in the centuries before Mowbray's taxonomy. None of them had had the dead sight. None of them had been bowed to. Harry filed those under distinguished. He looked last for the second of Mowbray's conditions, the presence of beings of death, and for the literature on Dementors in particular. He found a thin gray book by an unspeakable whose name had been redacted. The book described Dementors not, as the standard accounts did, as creatures of fear, but as creatures of necrotic affinity. They were, the unspeakable argued, attracted to the dead. They were attracted secondarily to anyone whose magic showed a similar signature. They were not, as the ministry believed, drawn to Azkaban because Azkaban contained criminals. They were drawn to Azkaban because Azkaban contained in its lowest cells 3 corpses preserved against decay by an ancient charm, and the Dementors had bound their roosts to those corpses for 2 centuries. Harry read this with interest. He noted after that on the Hogwarts Express in September the Dementors had hovered specifically near him. He noted that on the Hufflepuff pitch 12 of them had come. He noted that they had not come because he was Harry Potter. They had come because something in him had begun to read to their senses as kin. He closed the gray book. He sat back against the paneling. He thought in the precise way of a man whose calibrations had not yet started lying to him. Mowbray is right. I am what he said the first would be. The Dementors are an evidence rather than a threat. The dead are not haunting me. The dead are at last in a position to be heard. He was very calm. He sat under the cloak with his back against the paneling and a candle nowhere in the carrel and his wand against his chest, and let the calm be what it was, and noted that it was not pretending to be calm. It was calm. He thought then with the part of him that had grown up in a cupboard under a stair. This is the 2nd time in my life that the world has changed shape under me, and the first time I was 11 and frightened, and this time I am 13 and not. He thought I should examine the lack of fright. He examined it. He found that the lack of fright was not bravado, nor numbness, nor shock. It was a structural quality of the new shape of him. The new shape did not have the cavity that fright would have filled. The cavity had been replaced by what Mowbray had called the talent, and the talent did not register the situation as one to be feared. He thought this could be a problem. He filed the possibility under matters to watch. He noted that he would need to make sure that the talent's lack of fear did not become in him an absence of caution. He would need to be careful. He would need to be deliberately, externally careful, because the internal warning system that ordinary boys had been replaced by something with different priorities. This was useful. He understood the new instrument better for having identified what it lacked. He understood himself on the floor of the restricted section, with the cold seeping through the paneling and a 13-year-old's bones complaining at the position he had been holding for an hour, to be in a state that could be described in the technical language of his recent reading as a wizard whose capacity had been activated under known conditions, who had survived the activation, who had access to information about the activation, and who was in a position to undertake further study. It remained to determine what further study consisted of. He thought about this on the walk back through the corridors of the dead. The corridors of the dead at 3 a.m. were not unpopulated. A pair of women he had seen on the first day were still walking the long gallery. The boy with the wooden top was sitting on a step. A monk he had not seen before bowed as Harry passed from inside the wall without putting his face out far enough to be more than a shape. Harry inclined his head. He felt nothing odd about doing it. He felt, in fact, that he had been doing it all his life and had only just remembered. In the tower, he undressed in the dark and got into bed and lay for some minutes listening to Ron breathing 2 beds away. Ron's breathing was the same as it had always been. Harry registered the sameness with the dispassionate attention of a man checking that the rest of the world had not moved. He slept. He woke at the ordinary hour and went down to breakfast and ate ordinary food and answered ordinary questions from ordinary friends. He kept the system. The system held. He did this for 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks he attended classes. He sat for an exam in Transfiguration and scored an outstanding. He played a game of chess with Ron and lost in the ordinary way. He sat next to Hermione in the library and helped her with her arithmancy until she began to look at him strangely, at which point he made a joke about wanting to learn what was on her side of the parchment for once, and she laughed and looked at him less strangely. He read 3 more books in the restricted section. He learned to navigate the section in 20 minutes. He learned in a slim volume by a Spanish wizard, The Operative Theory of the Dead Sight, that the sight was not a sense imposed on his perception by an external force, but a previously walled-off channel of his own magic being permitted to register what had always been there. That the dead were not made solid by his looking at them. They had always been solid. His eyes had merely been allowed, finally, to admit what the bulk of their fellow eyes refused. He learned in another the theory of command, that the dead, like the living, were governed by the laws of consent and rank, and that a wizard with the talent did not impose his will on them in the way a wizard with a wand imposed his will on a frog. He requested. The dead answered the request because the request bore the signature of the talent, which they recognized as the proper authority. They could decline. They had, in the rare recorded cases of full talents, occasionally declined. They had declined less often than they had complied. He learned what kinds of dead he could in principle command: ghosts, in fairy, certain classes of shade, in theory given enough study, the lick and the wraith, possibly given far more study, what passed beyond the veil. He noted that the list was a list of categories he had read about in fiction since the age of 12. He did not find this surprising. He found, instead, that the categories had been waiting in the literature precisely because they were not fictional. The fictions had been written by wizards who knew. The categories had been preserved because someone had wanted to ensure they would be available when needed. He filed that thought under "Someone is rooting for me." He noted that he would need to find out who. At the end of the 2 weeks, on the night Mowbray had recommended on his calendar, the 3rd week of term after moonrise, he went, as instructed, to the dungeon corridor under the Slytherin entrance. He went alone. He did not bring the cloak. The Baron had not requested the cloak. He stood in the corridor with a torch in its bracket guttering at his back and a cold draught from the dungeon proper at his front, and the silver mark of the Baron's eyes already on him from the dark. The Baron stepped out of the wall. Harry had not seen the Baron from less than 30 feet before. From 30 feet the Baron had been a thin, tall figure in chains. From 3 feet the Baron was a man of unusual height with a face of unusual asymmetry, the left eye higher than the right, the cheekbone above the left eye scarred in a way no portrait had ever captured, the chains across his chest forged in a pattern Harry did not at first recognize and then did, the pattern of a binding charm now extinct, used in the 11th century to hold a wizard who could not be killed by any other means. The Baron alive had been bound in chains that could hold an unkillable man. Harry filed this under, useful to know. You have come, the Baron said. Yes, sir. You have read. Yes, sir. What have you read? Mowbray, Lineages and Talents, Chapter 4, Caspar Mowbray, 1602. The Baron did not move. What does Mowbray say? That I am the first wizard in 1,000 years with the full talent of the wand. The Baron's pale face moved a fraction. Say that again. I am the first wizard in 1,000 years with the full talent of the eldest Peveril brother. The Baron was silent. Have you tested Mowbray? He said. I have, sir. As far as I am able from the materials available, and he is correct, he is. The two words were not spoken with emphasis. They were spoken in the way an examiner agrees with a candidate's answer because the candidate's answer is correct. The Baron's eyes did not leave Harry's face. You have read the Grey Book. Yes, sir. The Dementors. Yes, sir. They will come for you again. I know, sir. They will not come to feed. They will come to be near. I know, sir, and I will need to be ready to command them when they do. The Baron did not answer. Turned instead and walked a slow circle around Harry in the corridor, and the chains across his chest made no sound, and his bare feet made no sound, and when he had come back to the position from which he had begun he stopped and looked at Harry as if seeing him properly for the first time. You are 13, the Baron said. Yes, sir. The eldest brother was 37 when he died. Yes, sir. He had been the eldest brother for 37 years. You have been what you are for 3 weeks. You will make errors, I know, sir. You will not survive most of them on your own. I know, sir. You will need a teacher. Yes, sir. The Baron's mouth twitched into something that was not quite a smile. I am not your teacher, he said. I am here because what you are has been waiting in this castle to be greeted properly. The greeting is done. From this point I will answer one question per visit and no more. You will come twice a month. You will keep secrets. You will read what I tell you to read in the order I tell you to read it. You will not raise anything until you have been instructed how to put it down again. If you raise something you cannot put down, I will not intervene. I will watch you fail to put it down, and I will watch what fails to put it down do whatever it does to you, and I will offer no assistance. Do you understand? Yes, sir. That is one rule. There are 6. I will give you the other 5 tonight. You will memorize them. You will not write them down. Yes, sir. The Baron gave him the other 5. Harry memorized them. They were not difficult. They were sensible. They were the rules a teacher would give a student in any apprenticeship of any difficult and dangerous craft. They were the rules of an apprenticeship in the most difficult and dangerous craft, and they did not contradict what the books had told him. They organized what the books had told him into an order he could practice from. The 5th rule was the one Harry would later return to most often. The 5th rule was, do not love what you have raised. The Baron did not explain it. Harry did not ask. He thought he understood, and he thought he would understand better in time, and he thought further that the Baron was right not to explain, because the rule would mean nothing to him until he had broken it once and been corrected by the breakage. He bowed. The Baron did not bow back. You will go now, the Baron said. You will not return for a fortnight. In the fortnight you will read the book in the 2nd alcove on the 3rd shelf from the bottom, the one in green leather, the one that does not have a title. You will read it once. You will not raise anything. You will come back to me on the next no moon. Yes, sir. Mr. Potter. Yes, sir. Welcome. The Baron stepped back into the wall. Harry stood for a moment in the empty corridor. He felt with the precision he was beginning to take for granted, something that he tried to name as he stood. It was not pride. It was not relief. It was, he decided, the feeling of a key fitting precisely into a lock that had been waiting for it. He had been welcomed. He had been welcomed by something 900 years dead, in a corridor sealed against the living, on the authority of a craft 1,000 years dormant in his blood. He found that he was not surprised by the welcome. He found, more interestingly, that he had been expecting it. He went up to the tower. In the tower he undressed. In the tower he lay down. In the tower, before he slept, he ran through the 6 rules in his head until he was certain of all of them. He found that he was certain. He found that he had filed them already under the part of his memory that did not forget. He thought last before he slept, I am the first in 1,000 years. He thought it without exultation. He thought it as a fact he had verified, against sources, on more than one night with cross-checks, and he thought it because he could not think anything else, because Mowbray was right, and the Baron had confirmed Mowbray, and the dead in the corridor had confirmed the Baron, and his own body had been confirming all of them since the pitch. He was the first in 1,000 years. He had a teacher. He had 6 rules. He had 3 weeks of further reading to do before he raised so much as a beetle. He had, in this more than the rest, settled the matter for him. Work. He slept. Outside the tower the night moved with its own business, and in the corridors below the dead went about theirs. and in the dungeon corridor under the Slytherin entrance, the bloody Baron stood in the wall and watched the door he had come out of and the door he had not come back through, and considered, with the patience of 900 years, what would come of the boy he had just welcomed and to whom he had just made himself, for the first time in his death, accountable. He decided that he was not afraid of what would come. He decided that he was not even certain afraid was the proper word for what he was. He decided that he would, in the fortnight, watch the boy from a distance and see how the boy did with the green leather book without supervision. He stepped back through the wall into the colder dark beyond and was gone. He did not begin with the green leather book. He began with 2 nights of preparation. He read the texts the Baron had ordered in the order the Baron had ordered them, and he made in his head a private map of which paragraphs would matter when. He spent one of those evenings in the Tower common room with Hermione's arithmancy beside him as cover, and he discovered that his face, by the small mirror she had brought down from her dormitory for some other purpose, had taken on a quality it had not had at the beginning of the term. The face was not different, the arrangement was different, there was less of him in it. He noted that the change was visible. He noted that it would have to be hidden. He practiced that evening in the mirror discreetly, while Hermione was bent over a logarithm, a series of small expressions he had not needed before. The expression of a boy hearing a joke. The expression of a boy not quite following a teacher. The expression of a boy who had been frightened by a corridor and was pretending not to be. He found that he could do all of them. He found that none of them lived in his face naturally. He would have to live in them by choice for as long as he was at this school. He filed the discipline under maintenance. On the second night he went up the Ravenclaw Tower stair under the cloak. He went without invitation. He went because Helena had told him to find her when he knew, and he knew. He stood at the foot of her tower in the dark and waited, and after a long pause her voice came out of the wall above him. "Come up," she said. He came up. Room at the top of the Ravenclaw Tower had been hers in life. It was not hers now in any official sense. It had been emptied and repurposed and emptied again, and currently held 3 broken telescopes and a chest of disused star charts. There was no fire, there was no chair, there was a window that opened east over the lake. He stood at the window with the cloak in his hand. She stood in the center of the room. She did not look at the lake, she looked at him. "You know," she said. "Yes, my lady." "Do not call me that, I gave it up. What do I call you?" "Helena, Helena." She was silent for some time. Her hair in the dim light from the lake was the color of unburnished pewter. Her eyes had not warmed. "My mother," she said, "was Rowena Ravenclaw. I have not said her name aloud in this room in 140 years. I say it tonight because you should know whose daughter spoke to you on Saturday, and because what I have to say to you cannot be said by anyone of less authority than the one who speaks it." He waited. "You will not be loved for this," she said. "Not by any of the living when they find out. They will not understand. They will give it a different name. They will ask you to put it down. You will not be able to put it down. Will not be willing to put it down after a time. They will then ask you to leave." He said, "Yes, you will let them ask. You will not promise them anything. The promise will be the first lie that costs you." "Yes, among the dead," she said, "you will be welcome. We have no requirement of a story. You are what we have been waiting for, and our waiting was earned, and we will keep faith with you. The Baron is the senior in this castle. The Friar will be the kindest. I will be the most useful." "Yes." "I will not be the warmest. No, Helena." She watched him. "Boy," she said, "you have a question." He had thought he had used his question for the fortnight. He understood that this was a different bank. "What did my mother do?" he said, "the night she died, that the killing curse did not take me?" He had not known before he asked that he would ask it. The question had been waiting in him behind another door, and now the door had opened. Helena did not answer at once. "Your mother's death," she said, "was not the protection. The protection was older. Your mother offered what she had to offer, which was love and refusal and the standing of a witch between a wand and her child. The protection took her offering and used it. The protection itself was not hers. The protection was what was in you, dormant. The killing curse touched a talent that the curse could not classify, and the curse turned on its caster as a knife turns in a hand that did not grip it correctly. That is the truth of that night. The headmaster has the half of it that names your mother. He has not been able to name the other half. He will not be able to. He is not, despite his attainments, a man whose mind admits of certain categories. You have been kept alive for 13 years on the half of the truth he has. It will keep you alive for some time longer. After that you will need the other half." He stood at the window. He did not speak. He had not expected the answer. He had expected a deflection. He had expected to be told he was not ready. He had been answered the question he asked, and the answer rearranged a portion of his life he had taken to be settled, and he stood in the rearrangement and let it happen. "My mother," he said after a long pause, "did not save me. Your mother offered, the talent took, your mother is owed the offering. Do not let the headmaster's story make her smaller than she was, but do not let it make her larger either." She was a good witch, and she loved her child. That is much. It is not the whole of why you live. Yes, there is a further thing. He waited. The killing curse left a residue in you. It is not your scar. The scar is incidental. The residue is in the part of you that woke on Saturday. You are not the only thing that woke. Something the curse carried is now inside the same room behind the same door. You will meet it in time. You will need to be ready for the meeting. Yes, do not be afraid of it. Do not befriend it either. Hold the door. Yes, she inclined her head. Go, she said. There is a book the Baron has told you to read. Read it tonight. There will be other nights for me. He bowed. He went down the stair. In the corridor at the bottom, he did not put the cloak on at once. He stood in the dark with the lake light coming through a slit window and considered what he had been told. He considered the residue. He considered that there was a piece of Voldemort in him in some sense, and that this piece had been in him since he was a baby, and that the piece had been quiet because the rest of him had been quiet, and that with the waking of the talent the piece had also woken, and that he would now have to live with it and against it and on top of it for as long as it took to learn what it was. He filed it under, a thing to study soon. He put the cloak on. He went to the library. He read the green leather book. The green leather book had no title and no author, and was bound in a leather that had not come off any animal Harry recognized, and it was, by the test the Baron had given him, not bound in the skin of a wizard, which meant it could be opened. He opened it. The book was a manual of practical raising. It was very old. It was in Latin. He could read Latin after a fashion. He had been taught some at Hogwarts, and the rest he could supply from the body of the writing and from the diagrams that occurred on every third page. The diagrams were not pleasant. They were not unpleasant either. They were technical drawings of dead things at various stages of being commanded, drawn in the matter-of-fact style of an anatomy textbook. There were notes, there were footnotes, there were warnings in red ink against certain combinations. He read the warnings twice. He noted that the warnings were written in the voice of someone who had themselves made the combinations and survived to write the warnings, which was the only voice in which such warnings could be trusted. He read the rest once through, without practicing. At the end he closed the book and sat for a moment with his hand on the cover. He had now read enough that he could, in principle, raise an inferius. He did not raise an inferius. He had been told to wait. He waited. He went back to the tower. He kept the rules. He did not in the next fortnight command so much as a sparrow. He attended classes. He sat the midterm exams. He helped Ron with divination, which Ron failed in the ordinary way. He let Hermione drag him to the second floor to discuss the Patronus, and he produced, in the empty corridor she had chosen, a thin silver shape that hovered for half a second longer than it had in Lupin's classroom, and Hermione looked at it and said with the precision that was her own form of love, "That's better, that's much better." He thanked her. He did not tell her that what he had thought of for the corporeal form had not been a parent or a Christmas or any of the textbook anchors. He had thought of the friar at the Hufflepuff table laughing at something he had said 300 years before. He had thought, there are things in this castle older than fear, and they remember me. The thought had been bright. The shape had grown out of the brightness. He did not tell her either that the shape had not been an animal. It had not yet decided what it was. It had hovered between three forms in the half-second before it dispersed, and one of the forms had had wings, and one had had no shape at all, and the third had looked momentarily like the silhouette of a man in a hood. He filed the observation under, "The Patronus is not a charm a necromancer can cast in the standard way. It is something else." He would learn what. At the end of the fortnight he went back to the Baron. He stood again in the dungeon corridor. The Baron came again out of the wall. "You have read the green leather book." "Yes, sir." "You did not raise anything." "No, sir." "Why? You told me not to. Other boys would have raised something. I am not other boys." The Baron's silvered face did not move. "That," he said, "is the answer that has settled the question for me. From this point you may begin the work. You will not begin in this castle. You will not begin in any inhabited place. You will begin in the Forbidden Forest at the summer beginning of your 4th year in the deepest glade you can find that has dead in it. The Acromantula colony will serve. They have in the last decade accumulated a great many dead. They will be your first." "Yes, sir." "You will go in alone. You will go in with the green leather book, and with the second book I will give you tonight. You will go in at the new moon. You will go in with no wand if you can manage it. Without a wand, you will not need it for the raising. You will need it for what you find waiting in the glade that did not die in the colony and that you will need to drive off briefly in order to begin. The forest is not by night an empty place. It is busy. The busyness is not friendly to either of us. Yes, sir, you will fail several times before you raise the first. You will not be hurt by failing. You will be hurt by succeeding too quickly. The dead, in their first moments of being commanded, are not docile. They are confused. They will attempt to obey what has called them, and being confused, they will obey badly. You will need to expect this. You will need to hold the calling steady until they understand whose voice has called them. Yes, sir, the voice is not the throat, the voice is the talent. You will speak with the throat as a convenience. You will not speak in English. You will speak in the old form which the green leather book has begun to teach you. By the end of this term you will speak it as easily as English. You will not speak it aloud where any living person can hear. Yes, sir. That is the lesson for tonight. Go, he bowed. The Baron this time inclined his head a fraction further than before. He went up to the tower. In the tower, in the dark, he sat on the edge of his bed and ran through what he now had. He had a teacher. He had 2 books read and a 3rd coming. He had a face he could keep on the surface of him that would pass for the face the world expected. He had a residue inside him that he would have to study soon, and that would not be easy. He had a talent confirmed by the only authority in the castle qualified to confirm it. He had 1,000 years of dormancy behind him. He had, in this more than the rest, settled the matter for him, a name now for what he was, supplied by Mowbray and by the dead and by his own work and by the Baron's instructive silences. He was a necromancer. Not the kind the books had warned against in the polite voice of ministry pamphlets. Not the kind a Death Eater might call himself in the small hours after his 2nd bottle. Not Voldemort, who had been clever and ambitious and willing to fold his soul into objects, but who had not had what Harry now had, because what Harry now had been folded in the bloodline of 3 brothers in the 11th century, and had skipped Voldemort's bloodline as it had skipped 1,000 others. He was the first in 1,000 years. He thought the word, he thought it once. He did not think it again. He understood that the word would now be the substrate of everything he did, and that to think it more than necessary would be to swell it into a thing that filled the room, and that the only way to wear the word correctly was to wear it so closely that it stopped sounding like a word at all. He lay down, he slept. In the corridors below, the dead went about their business, and at the window of the Ravenclaw Tower, Helena watched the lake until the sun came up, and in the dungeon corridor the Baron stood without moving for the rest of the night, and in the restricted section the green leather book lay where Harry had left it on the 3rd shelf of the 2nd alcove with its cover slightly warm to the touch. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. The first INFERI in the Forbidden Forest. The summer passed in Privet Drive in the ordinary way. He was in Privet Drive the boy he had taught himself to be in the spring. He moved through the days at the speed the days expected of him. He ate without complaint. He answered when spoken to. He gave Uncle Vernon no occasion for the speeches Uncle Vernon enjoyed. The Dursleys, who had no theory of him capable of accommodating what had occurred, perceived a Harry slightly easier to live with and were, in their constricted way, relieved. He read in the cupboard at night. He read by wandlight under the cloak, the 3rd book the Baron had given him. A slim octavo bound in undyed calf, written in 1421 by an English monk who had become a necromancer in late middle age and who had, before his execution, set down the entire practical foundation of the craft in a series of letters to a student who would not survive him. The monk had been an honest writer. He had not glorified what he taught. He had simply taught it. He had written about the breath and the posture and the way the voice had to descend into the chest before the calling, and he had written about which kinds of dead were most willing to be raised by a beginner, which it turned out was not the recent dead, who still carried the shape of being alive too clearly, but the dead who had been at rest long enough that they had forgotten what they had been, and who would come to a calling the way a long empty room comes to a lit lamp. He read the book through twice. He read separately 2 volumes of bestiary on acromantula physiology, which Hermione had ordered him for his birthday on the strength of his report of an interesting conversation with Hagrid. She had no idea why she had ordered them. He had asked. Hagrid wrote 3 times during the summer. Hagrid was teaching now and was thrilled about it and wanted Harry's opinion on a list of creatures suitable for the first lesson. Harry sent considered opinions back. He recommended against anything with a venom of more than Category 3 potency. He recommended against acromantulas, citing student safety. He recommended with the care of a boy who did not wish his preferences to be detectable hippogriffs. Hagrid replied that hippogriffs were a splendid idea. Harry filed, acromantulas remain available to me. He returned to Hogwarts. He returned to a school that was full of foreign students. The Triwizard Tournament had been announced in his absence. He read about it on the train with Ron and Hermione exclaiming over the print. He registered the news. He noted dispassionately that the tournament would be a screen of considerable density, behind which a great deal of work could be done unobserved. He noted, secondarily, that the tournament was a trap. He could not yet say whose trap. He could see only that an event of this kind at this school in this year, with the security so loudly proclaimed and the international observers so prominent and the goblet of fire so theatrically introduced, was being staged for some purpose other than the one being given. The purpose was not yet legible to him. He filed the question under watch. He did not have to wait for the goblet to put his name in. Someone else did that for him. He was, on the night of the choosing, summoned out of the hall to find himself a champion of a school whose other champion had not consented. The hall reacted as the hall reacted. He registered the reaction without surprise. He had expected by the evening of the choosing that whatever this tournament was about, it would be about him. He let the hall be what it was. He ate breakfast the next morning with Hermione. Ron was not at breakfast. Hermione watched him eat. Hermione said after a while, "Why aren't you angry? What good would it do?" "Harry, I don't know who put my name in. When I know, I will be angry at them in the appropriate way. Until then, there is nothing to be angry about that I can act on." She watched him with the attention she had begun to give his face on the second floor in May. "All right," she said. She did not press. He noted that she had stopped pressing in the last few months when he answered her in a certain register. He had not chosen the register. The register had become his. He completed the first task. He completed it in a manner he could have completed it. He had thought the night before about flying. He had then thought about other options. He had thought about an option that involved walking out of the tent without a wand and standing in front of the Hungarian horntail and looking at her until she put her head down, on the grounds that he could now, technically, ask things of beings whose response to him was governed by what he was. He had then filed this option under not yet visible to the public. He had used the broom. He had flown well. He had won. The hall had cheered. He had not. He went out to the forest that night. He had been waiting for the new moon, as the Baron had told him. The new moon was that night. He had the cloak. He had the green leather book in a pouch under his robes. He had the monk's calf-bound octavo also. He had no wand by the Baron's preference. He had a single iron knife at his belt, which the Baron had not forbidden and which he had borrowed from the kitchens. He went out through the doors after curfew. The grounds were dark. There was no moon. The lake was still. He walked across the grass with the cloak around him and the air cold and clean, and the dead in the corridors had not followed him, because the dead, in their courtesy, understood that what he was going to do was a thing he had not yet done and needed to do without an audience. He went into the forest. The forest by night was not the forest by day. He had been into the forest before. He had been into the forest in his first year, in his second year, in passing in his third. He had not been into the deep forest. He had not been into the glade. The glade was 1.5 miles in. He knew the location from Hagrid's letters and from a map he had drawn from those letters in his herbology margin. He walked. The trees were tall and the canopy was thick, and the only light was the soft phosphor of certain mosses on the trunks. He did not need much light. He had been told by the monk's book that the eyes of the talent adjusted in the dark in a way ordinary eyes did not, and on the path into the deep forest he found this was so. The dark, for him, was a different color. The trees were visible in it. The path was visible in it. The small wet things that moved in the undergrowth were visible in it. He walked for 40 minutes. He came to the glade. The glade was wide. The trees around it were ancient. The ground was bare in the center where the acromantulas had cleared it for their hunting and for their dyeing. There were in the perimeter the husks of perhaps 30 spiders the size of horses in various stages of decay. The most recent was a fortnight old. The oldest was, he stopped and read the carapace, perhaps 20 years. He stood in the center of the glade. He took off the cloak. He folded the cloak and put it on a flat stone. He took out the green leather book and the monk's octavo and laid them on the same stone, open at the pages he had marked. He stood, he breathed. The breath was the first part of the work. The breath descended, it descended into the chest, it descended into the belly. It descended below the belly into the place that was, by the monk's diagram, not anywhere a Muggle anatomy could have located, but that the talent recognized the way a hand recognizes its own grip on an object it has held 1,000 times. He breathed there, he held the breath there, he let the breath release. The glade did not change, the trees did not change, the carapaces did not change. He breathed again. He held the breath in the place below the belly, he let it release. The third breath came easier, the fourth was easier still. By the 7th he had located the reservoir, the pressure he had felt under his skin in the hospital wing, and he could feel it now flowing upward from where it had been folded, and he could feel it filling the cavity of his throat and rising into the cavity of his mouth without the muscles of either moving. He spoke. He did not speak in English. He spoke in the old form, as the Baron had instructed, as the monk's letters had taught, as the reservoir had wanted to speak since the pitch. He spoke, "Come up." He did not say it with his throat. His throat made the air for it. The talent shaped the air into the meaning the dead would hear, in the channel they were obliged to hear in. The glade did not respond at once. He waited. He spoke again. He spoke, "Come up. By the line of the eldest brother, by the right of the line, by the calling that has not been heard 1,000 years, come up." The first of the carapaces shifted. It was the youngest. It was a spider that had died in early autumn, perhaps 2 months gone, the legs still articulated, the carapace not yet broken open by the wet. It shifted on its side and then on its back, and then slowly, with a sound that was not quite a sound, it began to rise. It rose to its feet. It stood on its feet. It turned its head, what would have been its head, to him. He looked at it. He said, "Stand." It stood. He breathed. He spoke, "Those who are with you, come up." Around the perimeter of the glade, the carapaces shifted. The second one rose, the third, the fourth. The dozen or so that were still mostly articulated rose first. The more decayed ones rose more slowly. 2 of them did not rise because there was not enough of them left to be raised, and he felt the failure of those 2 as a precise resistance in the reservoir, like a pipe asked to carry more water than it had been built for, and he relented and let them rest. The ones who had risen turned, all of them, to him. They stood in a wide arc around the center. He counted, with the calm precision of a man doing inventory, 27. He said in the old form, "Hear me." They heard. He said, "This glade is your post. You will not leave it without my word. You will not feed without my word. You will not be seen by any living thing that comes to this glade who does not call my name. You will know my name because it is the name that called you. You will obey no other." They inclined what could be inclined. He said, "You are mine." They inclined again. He let the breath go. He stood alone with his army of 27 dead spiders in the new moon dark in the center of a glade 1.5 miles into the forbidden forest. And what he felt in the precise instrument of his chest was not exultation, was not awe, was not horror, was not pride. What he felt was correctness. This was the right shape of him. This was what the shape had been waiting to be for. He breathed once more. He picked up the books. He picked up the cloak. He turned and walked out of the glade, and the 27 did not follow because they had been told not to follow, and they stood in their wide arc and waited for the next instruction whose form they could not yet imagine and which they would receive in time. He walked back through the forest. He came to the edge of the trees. He stood at the edge of the trees for a moment and looked at the castle. The castle, from the edge of the trees, was a black shape with 3 lit windows. 2 were the staff windows where teachers were grading or drinking late. The third was Dumbledore's. The light in Dumbledore's window was steady. He looked at it. He did not feel watched. He felt watched by everything else in the world. He did not feel watched by Dumbledore. Dumbledore was still asking the question. Dumbledore had not yet found a way to ask it that would compel an answer. Dumbledore would, perhaps, find such a way. By the time he did, Harry would have moved further. He put the cloak on. He walked across the grass. He went up to the tower. He slept. He completed the second task. He used, as the textbook called for, gillyweed. He could have used other methods. He did not need them yet. He swam in the lake. He saved Ron. He saved, on a separate impulse he did not at first identify, the small French girl whose sister had been left at the bottom. He saved her because she had been left there, and because to leave a child below the water in his presence was now, to the calibration in him, intolerable. He noted the intolerance. He filed it under. This is one of the things the new instrument prefers. He came up. He was scored low for going slowly. The points did not interest him. He went back to the glade in the deep forest twice between the second and third tasks. On the first visit he tested the 27 on simple instructions. They obeyed promptly. He noted the speed of obedience with the dispassion of an engineer testing a relay. He did not push them. He had been told by the monk's book not to push a new contingent until they had been bound for at least 1 full moon cycle. He gave them their cycle. On the second visit he added to them. There had been in the intervening weeks 3 further deaths in the colony, 2 from sickness and 1 from a fight he gathered Hagrid had not been told about. The corpses were fresh. He raised them in the same form. They came up willingly. The army was now 30. He stood and looked at his 30. He said, "Any other dead in this forest that the centaurs have not buried and that have lain unrested for more than 10 winters, hear me. Come to this glade in your own time. Stand at the perimeter when you arrive. Wait." He noted in the days that followed that the centaurs avoided the deep glade. He noted in the second week that the unicorn herd avoided a wide arc around the glade. He noted in the third week that Hagrid, who knew the forest better than any living man, ceased to go in past a certain birch. He noted, finally, that the centaur Ferenza met him one evening at the edge of the trees, when Harry had been crossing the grounds to dinner. Ferenza did not bow. Ferenza was a centaur. He inclined his head, which was the centaur equivalent. "You have woken something," Ferenza said. "Yes. The herd has marked the glade. Yes. You will not bring it to the school. Number, you will not be permitted to bring it past the third stream." "I know." Ferenza watched him. "You are very young," he said, "for what you are doing." "Yes." "Do you intend to grow into it?" "Yes." Ferenza considered. He inclined his head again. He walked back into the trees. Harry continued to dinner. He did not tell anyone. He completed the third task. He completed it as the year asked him to complete it. He went into the maze. He passed the obstacles. He met Cedric at the cup. He reached for the cup with Cedric because Cedric was a decent boy and they had agreed, and the portkey took them both. The portkey took them to a graveyard. The graveyard was in a village he could not name. The grass was uncut. There was a marble headstone with a name Harry recognized. There was a small figure carrying a bundle. The figure was Pettigrew, whom he had last seen in March, when Pettigrew had escaped because he had escaped. The bundle was something alive in the way that a thing held to be wrapped is alive. Pettigrew killed Cedric without ceremony. Harry registered the killing. He registered the green light arc. He registered the body falling. He registered Cedric looking suddenly young, with no face to him anymore, only the shape of one. He registered the cold reservoir in his chest extending as a quiet matter around Cedric's body, a standby mode rather than an action. He did not raise Cedric. The talent would not have raised Cedric without his asking, and he did not ask. Cedric had died here. Cedric would have to be returned to his father in the form his father expected. Pettigrew bound Harry to the headstone. Pettigrew made the potion. Pettigrew put the bundle in the cauldron. What came out of the cauldron was a wizard. What came out of the cauldron was, technically, the wizard whose name Harry was not permitted by most of the wizarding world to say. Voldemort rose from the cauldron. He rose thin. He rose in the white skin and the absence of features and the red eyes that the textbooks of Harry's first year had not described, because no textbook of Harry's first year had been written by anyone who had seen Voldemort in this incarnation. He rose and looked at his Death Eaters as they apparated in and gave the speech. The speech was a speech. Harry registered the speech as he had registered Cedric's death as data. He looked throughout the speech at Voldemort. He looked at Voldemort with the eyes the talent had given him, which were now his ordinary eyes and which had been refined over a year of work into an instrument of considerable acuity. He saw with those eyes what no one else in the graveyard saw. He saw the soul. He saw where Voldemort's soul ought to have been, a thing that was not whole. It was a thing that had been cut. It was a thing that had been cut not once but several times. He could count the cuts. He saw he had not been told to look for this. He saw it because he had the eyes, that the soul in front of him was a fragment of a soul that had been distributed across at least 6 other locations. He counted the absences. He counted 6, he counted 7 if he counted with a precision he did not entirely understand and that he would understand later, the fragment that was now in himself. He noted 7. He noted, this is the answer to a question I had not yet asked. He noted, Helena was correct. He filed it all under, now I know what he has done, and now I know what I have to do. Voldemort finished the speech. Voldemort offered him a duel. Harry accepted because to decline would have been a tell, and to flee would have been a tell, and there was no other course consistent with what he had decided in the hospital wing. He dueled by the textbook. He cast disarming. He cast stunning. He cast expelliarmus. He let the priori incantatum do what the wand wanted to do. He let Cedric's shade speak and James's shade speak and Lily's shade speak. Lily's shade, who was not the Lily of the hospital wing dream, who was not the Lily who had answered him about the night of his death, but who was the Lily Voldemort's wand had killed 13 years earlier, and who was, to that wand, simpler and louder and easier to summon than the Lily Harry had been speaking to in the hospital wing. He took the portkey, he took Cedric, he returned to the school. He gave his account to Dumbledore. He gave it in the language Dumbledore was expecting. He told Dumbledore about the cauldron. He told Dumbledore about the speech. He told Dumbledore about the duel. He told Dumbledore about the priori incantatum. He did not tell Dumbledore about the 7. He saw in Dumbledore's face that Dumbledore was watching for what Harry had decided not to tell. He maintained the face. He let Dumbledore use legilimency briefly, as Dumbledore did when listening to a witness give an account of significance. Helena had warned him of this on the Ravenclaw stair, and Sir Nicholas had drilled him in the spring on what a non-occlumens could nonetheless do to hold the surface of his mind steady, and he held the surface steady, and Dumbledore did not press, because to press would have been an offense Dumbledore had not yet decided to commit against him. He went up to bed. He slept. He dreamed that night of the glade. In the dream, the 30 stood in their arc as they had been left, and behind them at the perimeter were now another dozen shapes he did not at first recognize. And when he looked more carefully, he saw that they were old shapes, not acromantulas, dead longer than 10 winters, who had heard him at last and had come from elsewhere in the forest to wait. He looked at them in the dream, and he was not surprised. He had told them to come. They had come. He woke at dawn. In the dormitory, the others were still asleep. Outside, the lake was a gray sheet. He sat up against the pillow and looked at the window and thought about the 7 and the 30 and a dozen and the thing in the cauldron and the thing in the long room behind the door inside his own skull. He thought in the precise voice that had become his interior voice, I have built the first of 3 armies. I have located the work that will use them. I have at the close of my 4th year what I will need to begin in earnest at the beginning of my 5th. He thought, I am 15 at the end of this summer. He thought, I am 15, and the Dark Lord I will have to put down has put 6 pieces of himself into the world, and I have been carrying one of them since I was a year old, and I have an army of 40-some inferi in a glade in the forest, and I have a teacher dead 900 years, and I have only the beginning of what I will need. He thought, I will need more. He thought, in the Department of Mysteries there are 3 liches who have been waiting in crystal since the Goblin Wars. He thought, that is next. He got up. He went down to breakfast. He sat between Ron and Hermione and ate toast and laughed once and answered when asked, and the room around him was loud with the ordinary loudness of a school in morning, and behind the ordinary loudness, in the corridor by the door, 3 of the older ghosts stood in a line he had not asked them to form, and as he passed them on his way out they bowed to him, in the small and precise bow of men acknowledging a sovereign of a kind not yet officially declared. He inclined his head. He went to lessons. He waited for the next summer. In the months between the 3rd task and the end of the year, the brief tale of June after the graveyard, he went, once more, into the deep forest. He went on a Tuesday after dinner when the school was busy with end-of-term examinations and no one was looking for him. He walked into the trees with the cloak in his hand and the iron knife at his belt and the cool air on his face and the certainty in his chest that the work he was about to do was different in kind from the work he had done at the new moon. At the new moon he had raised. This time he would teach. He came to the glade. The 30 stood in their arc. The dozen had arrived. They stood in a further arc behind the 30. They were older. Their forms were the husks of unicorns the centaurs had not been able to retrieve, of 1 boarhound that had died in winter and been preserved by the cold, of 2 human shapes Harry did not at first place and that turned out on examination to be the bones of medieval poachers who had died in the trees and been forgotten. He bowed to them. He did not raise them further. They were already raised by the call he had sent on the 2nd visit and by their own choice to come. He stood in the center. He spoke in the old form. He spoke, you who are mine, attend. They attended. He spoke, I will be away from this glade for 3 months. You will remain. In my absence, one of you will speak my name to the rest, and the name will be a placeholder for me, and any instruction issued through the name will be received as if from me. The one who speaks the name will be chosen now. He looked along the arc. He chose the oldest carapace, the 20-year spider who had been the matriarch of the colony in life and who had risen at the new moon with a stillness the others had lacked. He spoke, you. The matriarch inclined what she could incline. He spoke, hold the place. Keep the perimeter, bring no one in, send no one out. When I return, I will release you to your 2nd task. She inclined again. He looked at the rest. He spoke, I will return at the 1st new moon of August. You will know it because the matriarch will tell you. Until then you will not be visible to any living thing that comes to this glade who does not call my name. You will not feed, you will not be seen, you will stand. They stood. He went out. He walked the long path back to the tree's edge. He came out under the soft late dusk of a June evening. The grounds were empty. He went up to the castle. In the entrance hall he found Hermione, who had been waiting. She had not been waiting outside. She had been waiting just inside, in the alcove by the staircase, which was where she went when she did not want to be obvious that she was waiting. She came out as he came in. She had a book in her hand, which was her cover. You went out, she said, for a walk, in the dark. I had the cloak, Harry. He stopped. He looked at her. He had, since the spring, accumulated a list of moments in which Hermione had been on the threshold of asking. Each time he had let her not ask, each time she had let herself not ask. The list was now of some length, and the list was the kind of list a friend keeps without writing down, because the writing down would commit her to the asking. He saw in her face that she had decided she would ask. He said before she asked, I have been studying something. She watched him. Will you tell me what? He thought in the precise interior voice about the 5th rule. He thought about the fact that to tell her was to invite her to make him stop, and that he would not stop, and that she would then have to decide whether to remain his friend in the knowledge that he would not stop, and that the decision would be a difficulty for her of a kind no 14-year-old should have to undertake. He thought further that not telling her was its own kind of decision. He thought finally that he had time. Not yet, he said. Why? Because I am still studying. When I have finished studying, I will tell you what I have been studying. When will that be? I don't know, perhaps a year. Perhaps 2. She watched him. You are not in danger, she said. It was not a question. I am not in danger from what I am studying. From other things, yes. Voldemort, yes. She breathed out. All right, she said. All right, Harry, I won't ask again. I want you to remember that I asked. I will. She held his eyes another moment. She nodded once. She walked off toward the tower. He stood in the entrance hall and considered, with the same kind of dispassion he had used in the graveyard, the cost of what had just been done. He had not lost her. She had not asked again. But she had marked between them a place she had agreed not to cross, and the agreement was not a kindness, it was an instrument. She had built the instrument because she knew in the part of her that did not require evidence that something had changed in him, and she had built it so that when the time came for her to choose, she could choose against the agreement and force the question. He noted the instrument. He filed it under, when the choice comes, she will choose to know. Prepare for that. He went up to the tower. He slept. He did not see that night the second of his armies. He did not yet have a second. He had only the first in the glade, and behind that the long room behind the door inside his skull, and behind that the residue Helena had warned him of, which had been silent all year and which would not be silent forever. In the train back to King's Cross the carriage was quiet. Cedric's death had folded over the school's noise. Ron read the Daily Prophet. Hermione looked out the window. Ginny, who shared the compartment for the last hour because her own had been overcrowded, read a book and did not speak. Harry watched the countryside. He registered the fields. He registered the woods. He registered with the eyes that had now been adjusted to a certain depth of sight, the presence in those woods of various small dead things that had been there a long time, and that did not yet know him, and that in time he might or might not call. He thought, I have a year. He thought, in a year I will go into the Department of Mysteries, and I will retrieve what was preserved in crystal in the Goblin Wars, and I will bring it out of the Ministry into the world, and that will be the second of my armies, and the second will be of a different order than the first. He thought, I am 15. He thought, with the precise dispassion the year had refined, this is not too soon. The train pulled in. He got off. Mrs. Weasley was on the platform, and Mr. Weasley, in Sirius in his dog form, who had come to see him off the train and who pressed against his leg in the bustle of the platform with the affection of a man who had not been able to be a father and who was trying in the small and physical way of a dog to be one for an evening. Harry put his hand on the dog's head. He said quietly, "Hello, Padfoot." The dog looked up at him. The dog's eyes were the eyes of his godfather, who had been a young man 12 years ago and who had been a prisoner 10 years. And who had spent the last year in caves living on rats and writing letters to his godson on stolen parchment. The eyes were tired. The eyes were also, when they looked at Harry, sharp. The dog read him. The dog read him in a way no other living person on the platform was reading him. Harry let the dog read him. He gave the dog more to read than he had given anyone since the hospital wing. He did it because Sirius was, in his way, family, and because if anyone in the world could be told a portion of what had happened, it was Sirius, who had himself been a registered animagus by 16, who had himself raised a small private rebellion against the most powerful headmaster of the century by the time he was 17, and who would not, Harry believed, flinch. The dog held his eye. The dog made in its throat a sound that was not a growl, was not a whine, was not a sound a dog could ordinarily make. The sound was very low. The sound was, in the human dialect of the dog, a question. Harry inclined his head slightly. The dog acknowledged. That was all of it. The two of them had spoken across a frequency the rest of the platform did not register, and what they had said was not yet a sentence. It was the beginning of a sentence Sirius would now begin to write in his own time in the months ahead. Harry let his hand fall. The dog moved off. He got into the Dursleys' car. The car drove him to Privet Drive. In Privet Drive he had a summer. He spent the summer reading. He spent the summer running in the early mornings, before Aunt Petunia woke, in the path along the park, which gave him the long aerobic capacity he had calculated he would need for the next year's work. He spent the summer cataloging in his head the texts he had read so far and the texts he would need to read next. He spent the summer being studied by the Order of the Phoenix. He had known the order existed by the end of the previous year. He had known their members by the end of the first week of summer. They came in shifts to watch his street, and the shifts were not as discreet as they thought. He noted the names: Tonks, Diggle, Lupin, Sturgis Podmore, Hestia Jones, Emmeline Vance. He noted their schedules. He filed them under. It will be useful to know the order's blind spots when the time comes to use the order as cover. He did not that summer raise so much as a beetle. He went in his sleep several times to the glade. He found the glade as it had been left. He found that the matriarch in his absence had begun to teach the others, to refine their stances, to coordinate their attention, to develop, in the limited vocabulary of the raised, a discipline they had not had at the new moon. He approved. He let them be. He waited for September. In September he went back to the school. At the school, in the entrance hall, the dead came out to greet him. They did not, of course, come out openly. They came out in the way they came out for him alone. Sir Nicholas inclined his head as he passed the staircase. The friar smiled from the kitchen's stairwell. The Baron was not visible. The Grey Lady was not visible. The corridors hummed with the dead going about their business and the dead, in passing, marking him. He went up to the tower. He unpacked. He went down to dinner. At dinner, the new defense professor was a woman in pink with a face that did not move, and she was introduced by Dumbledore with the brevity the school used to indicate a hostile installation. Harry registered her. He registered her name. He filed her immediately under. An instrument of the ministry, not a teacher, she will attempt to bring the school into the ministry's compliance. She will fail because the school does not bend. She will be in his way for a year. The year will be useful in spite of her because her presence will make a great deal of activity less observable, because everyone, including Dumbledore, will be watching her. He looked after a moment at Dumbledore. Dumbledore was looking at the woman in pink. Dumbledore looked briefly at Harry. Their eyes met. They held the meeting for a beat. They did not, this time, hold it longer than was usual. Dumbledore looked away first. Harry registered this. He filed it. He kept eating. After dinner, in the corridor outside the Great Hall, the Baron stepped out of the wall as Harry was going up to the tower and inclined his head and said, "The work begins next week." "Yes, sir. You will not begin in the forest. The forest is finished for this year. You will begin in the library." "Yes, sir. You will read 3 books on the geometry of the Department of Mysteries. I will give you the titles. You will not write them down." "Yes, sir." The Baron gave him the 3 titles. Harry memorized them. The Baron stepped back through the wall. Harry went up. In the tower, in the dormitory, Ron was already in his own bed, telling Dean and Seamus a story about the World Cup that had nothing to do with the world Harry was now living in. Harry undressed. He got into bed. He let Ron's voice be the ordinary voice of a friend telling an ordinary story to other friends, and he let the ordinary voice be the ordinary thing it ought to be, and he let himself be, briefly, a 14-year-old in a dormitory in the country. He slept. Outside the dormitory, in the corridors, the dead moved. In the deep glade in the forest, the matriarch held her 30 and her dozen in their arcs and waited for the summon. In the 3rd tower, Helena stood at her window over the lake and watched. In the dungeon corridor, the Baron stood in the wall and waited. In the Department of Mysteries, behind doors no living person currently in the building had been authorized to open, 3 minds that had been in crystal for 800 years stirred at the edge of the calling that had begun in the spring of his 3rd year to reach them through the strata of the world. They did not yet know who he was. They were beginning to feel that they would. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. The LICHES of the Department of Mysteries, the first month of 5th year, was useful for what was not happening in it. The woman in pink Umbridge was, as Harry had predicted in the Great Hall on the night of the feast, an installation of the ministry whose function was to make the school an extension of the ministry. She was not a teacher. She was a presence in a classroom. The classroom delivered in the matter of the patroness and the stunner and every other practical defense the curriculum required exactly nothing. She required reading. She required note-taking. She required the production on parchment of essays of correct length on the theory of defensive magic. This suited Harry's purposes precisely. What suited his purposes was a year in which the only competent defense professor he had ever had was no longer at the school, in which the most observant teacher in the castle besides Dumbledore was a witch whose attention was now permanently fixed on Umbridge, and in which every adult in the building was so consumed by the ministry's slow takeover that no one was looking at the students. He kept his head down. He kept his marks in the upper 2nd tier, high enough not to be flagged for poor performance, low enough not to be flagged for promise. He took a clumency from Snape. A clumency from Snape had been arranged because Dumbledore had had a suspicion that Voldemort might be in Harry's mind, and a clumency was a discipline that addressed minds being in minds. Harry had received the order with grave courtesy. He had understood on the night Dumbledore explained that Dumbledore was not entirely wrong. There was something in his mind that was not him, and the something was the residue Helena had identified on the Ravenclaw stair, and a clumency would, in fact, be useful against it. He had also understood that to learn a clumency from Snape, and to use it as Dumbledore wanted, would be to expose every wall in his mind to the most experienced legilimens currently working for the Order. He had decided in the corridor outside Dumbledore's office that this was acceptable. It was acceptable for 2 reasons. The first reason was that Snape was, in the matter of legilimency, predictable. Snape entered a mind for one of 2 purposes, to ascertain a specific fact or to inflict a specific humiliation. He did not enter a mind to map it. He did not enter a mind to wander. He did not enter a mind to discover things he had not been looking for. If Harry's walls were arranged correctly, and Harry by October had arranged them correctly, Snape would meet a series of plausible humiliations and a series of plausible facts and would have no reason to look behind them. The second reason was that Snape was, in the matter of the suspicion he had been carrying since the hospital wing corridor, no longer interested in confirmation. Snape had moved in the year and a half since from suspecting Harry of a thing he could not name to recognizing that whatever it was now too deep to extract by ordinary legilimency. Snape had, on the matter, made a private decision. Snape's private decisions were, in their narrow sphere, exact. He would not betray Harry to Voldemort. He would not betray Harry to Dumbledore. He would teach the occlumency he had been asked to teach, and he would observe in the teaching what could be observed, and he would file the observations under a question whose answer would not be supplied by this room. Harry, having read Snape correctly on the day in the hospital wing corridor, took the lessons. He took them in the manner Snape required. He failed at them the first several times in the manner a 15-year-old of moderate competence and intense annoyance would fail at them. He improved by the end of November to the degree that Snape's professional pride required. He did not improve further. Snape watched him not improve further, said nothing about it, and dismissed him. After the 8th lesson in the corridor outside Snape's office, Snape stopped him. "Potter, sir." Snape stood in the dim corridor and looked at him with the eyes Harry had been ready for since the Tuesday morning in 3rd year. "Whatever you are doing," Snape said, "you will do it with the consideration due to those who would die for any side in this war. You will not extend that consideration to me. You will extend it to others. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir. Go." He went. He understood the message. He filed it. He noted that Snape had given him, in 12 words, more useful information about Snape than Snape had given him in 5 years of lessons. The DA formed. The DA formed because Hermione was Hermione, and because Ron was loyal, and because the defense curriculum was failing every student in the building, and because Umbridge's prohibition on practical defense had created a vacuum that the older students of the castle would not tolerate. Harry agreed to lead it. He agreed because to refuse would have been a tell. He agreed because the DA was, for his actual purposes, a substantial improvement, a structured cover for his absences, a public reason for his after-curfew movements, a body of students who would be grateful to him for teaching them the Patronus, and a record for any subsequent ministry inquiry of him as a 16-year-old running a clandestine defensive magic study group. He taught the DA the Patronus. He taught it well. He taught it without revealing the form his own had taken. He let them practice on each other, on Boggarts when Lupin's textbook permitted, on a tame Dementor borrowed from a private collection no one in the room asked about. He paid attention in particular to Neville, who improved at a rate no textbook would have predicted. He noted Neville. He filed Neville under a useful soul, reconsider in a year. He went into the library on the nights the DA was not meeting. He went into the library under the cloak on a schedule that had no detectable pattern. He read the 3 books the Baron had named in September. He read them with the same care he had read Mowbray in 3rd year. He read them in the order they ought to be read, which was not the order of their publication or the order of their authorship, but the order in which they made sense to a wizard who already knew what they were trying to teach. The 3 books were Hambrook's Topography of the Lower Ministry, 1817, a textbook on the architecture of the Department of Mysteries, written by an unspeakable upon retirement, suppressed within 2 years, surviving only in 3 copies of which one was in the Hogwarts restricted section. Hambrook had detailed the floor plan. He had named the rooms. He had given dimensions. He had noted in a series of appendices the various wards and the various ways those wards had failed over the centuries. The Goblin Wars and the Lower Confinements, Anonymous, 1742. A history of the practice, current in the 17th and early 18th centuries, of binding the most dangerous prisoners of the Goblin Wars not in prisons but in vaults below the ministry, in crystalline preservation, on the grounds that what could not be killed should at least be stopped. The history named in passing the 3 liches who had been preserved in the vault of the Long Sleep at the end of the 4th Goblin War, in 1612. Their names had been redacted in the published text. The redactions had been made by hand, in a different ink, by an editor whose name was also redacted. The redactions had not been thorough. Harry had needed 20 minutes with a candle and a strong wand light to read the names beneath. The names were Kethrim, who had been a wizard of Saxon Britain dead 2 centuries by the time he was confined; Voralazar, who had been a witch of the Caucasus dead 3; Senithorix, who had been a Hungarian magister whose dates were not known, and whose form was not stable, and whose presence in the vault was a matter of considerable internal dispute among the unspeakables of the period. The 3rd book was an oral history. It was a slim manuscript, never published, in the hand of an unspeakable named Yarrow, given to the Hogwarts Library in 1894 with the condition that it not be read except by direct dissent of its author. The condition had been ignored. Harry read it. Yarrow's history described with the fluency of someone who had been there the binding of the 3. He named the wards, he named the failure points, he named the keys. He named, more usefully, the conditions under which the wards would not hold against a wizard who possessed the talent and who arrived in the vault carrying the calling. For Yarrow had written with a frankness no unspeakable would have permitted himself in print. The liches had been bound not against unkillable wizardry in general, but against the wizardry of their own makers. They had been bound by death magic identical to their own, and the binding presumed that no further wizard of that craft would ever arrive to challenge it. Yarrow had thought that presumption foolish. Yarrow had written in the margin, "One will come." Harry had read the marginal note 3 times. He had closed the manuscript. He had sat in the restricted section in the silence of the 3rd hour after curfew and considered, with the precise dispassion he had developed, what now lay before him. He had to go to the Department of Mysteries. He had to enter the vault. He had to break the binding. He had to bind the 3 to himself in their place. He had to do it without being seen, without being heard, without leaving traces, without raising alarm, and without being where he was going. The last condition was the difficult one. The Ministry building was, by Hambrook, accessible to the public only at the upper levels. The Department of Mysteries occupied the 9th floor and the lowest. The 9th floor had a single entrance and a single exit, both warded against apparition and portkey, both staffed at every hour. The lowest level, the Vault of the Long Sleep, was reached by a stair that began at the 9th floor and descended through a series of further warded passages that had been mapped by no one outside the department in 200 years. He could not walk in. He could not apparate in. He could not portkey in. He had to enter, if he was to enter at all, by a method none of the wards anticipated. He spent 4 nights on this, he thought, in the manner of a problem he had been given. He listed the methods that had been used historically to enter places that did not admit entry. He listed 12. He eliminated 9 on the grounds of incompatibility with his level of skill and his access to materials. He eliminated 2 further on the grounds that they would leave traces. He was left with 1. The one was the method that had been used by the eldest brother Peveril in the late 11th century against his own enemies, and that had not been used in any documented case since the wand had passed out of his line. The method was the dream link. The dream link was not a journey. The dream link was the use of a quality of the talent to extend the wizard's self through the channel by which the dead recognized him. A wizard who possessed the talent and who possessed the calling and who possessed the experience of having raised could, in theory, travel through the channel of the dead bodilessly, without alarm to any ward keyed against the living, without trace to any sensor keyed against magic, into any location where there was a dead thing that recognized the call. In theory. The theory had been described once in Yarrow's manuscript in a paragraph that read like a footnote. Yarrow had not seen it done. Yarrow had heard it described by an aged unspeakable who had heard it described by his master. The technique was older than the statute of secrecy. The technique was, in the literature of the talent, the bridge between raising and command, the proof that the talent's reach was not a function of the body it inhabited. There was a dead thing in the vault of the long sleep. There were in fact 3. The 3 were not inferi, not ghosts, not wraiths. They were liches. Their relation to the call was particular. They had themselves been wizards of the talent in their lifetimes, and the talent in them had not been the dormant talent of the Peveril line. It had been a lesser branch, descended over centuries, refined by personal application into something that mimicked, in its operation, the original. They had used the lesser branch to preserve themselves past death. They had used it to retain consciousness in their own bones. The unspeakables had bound them at the moment of binding by a charm that exploited this very fact. Their consciousness was the lock, and the binding pressed against the consciousness. The binding had held for 800 years because no talent of the order required to address the consciousness directly had emerged. The binding would not hold against a wizard who could speak to the consciousness as kin. Harry filed the analysis under, "I am the wizard." He filed it without exultation. He filed it as the engineering it was. He waited for the right night. The right night was the night of the new moon in February. By February, the DA had been running for 3 months and was in the middle of its mid-term break when meetings were suspended. Hermione had gone home for a week with Ron. Umbridge was occupied with a ministry inspection that took the entire staff into the dungeons, and the castle's attention was elsewhere. He went up to bed at the ordinary hour. He drew the curtains. He lay on his back. He breathed as he had breathed in the glade. He breathed below the belly. He found the reservoir. He extended the reservoir by a faculty he had practiced since November on smaller distances, beyond the body. The faculty was difficult. It was difficult in the way running was difficult to a man who had never run. It was not difficult to the new instrument in him. The new instrument knew the motion. It was difficult to the body wrapped around the instrument, which had not been built for it. He sweated. He held the breath. He held the breath in the place below the belly and let the reservoir move out of him, in the direction of London, in the direction of the dead, in the department of mysteries who could hear what he was sending. He felt them respond. He felt them respond in 3 places. The 3 places were the vault. He went to the vault. He did not arrive in the vault as a body. He arrived in the vault as a presence. He saw the vault around him as the dead saw it. He saw the 3 figures in their crystal. He saw the wards laid over the crystal as a web of light. He saw behind the web the 3 minds, and the 3 minds turned in the slow rotation of their long sleep toward him. The first to speak was Kethrim. The voice of Kethrim was a voice that had not been used in 8 centuries. It came up through the crystal as a stone comes up through deep water. It said, on the tongue of the line of the line. It was not English. It was the old form, the form in which the Baron had drilled him for 2.5 years. The form he could now think in as easily as in English. He understood the meaning. The meaning was a greeting and a question at once. You speak in the line of the eldest brother. What is the line of your line? He answered. He answered in the form. He said, I am the line. I am the unbroken descent. I am the first since. There was a pause. There was a pause of a length he could not measure in the dream link, because the dream link did not move at the pace of seconds. It moved at the pace of recognitions. Voralazar spoke next. Her voice was higher and more broken than Kethrim's. She had been alive longer ago. She had carried in her crystal a depth of damage Kethrim had not. She said, come, undo the wall. We will follow whom we follow. He said, I will undo the wall. I will undo it on the conditions of the binding I will lay. The conditions will be these. He named the conditions. The conditions were the rules. He had had them since the autumn. He had drafted them himself on the basis of the monk's letters and the green leather book and 3 of the Baron's quieter lessons. The conditions named, with precision, the obligations he would owe the 3 and the obligations they would owe him. He did not ask for total obedience. Total obedience was not the talent's relation to its bound. He asked for the precise form of allegiance the line of the eldest brother had received from such beings in the 11th century. He asked for it on the same terms. Kethrim heard the conditions. Voralazar heard the conditions. Senethorix, whose voice he had not yet heard and whose form was not stable, heard the conditions through the medium of the other 2, because Senethorix did not speak in the old form in the way the others spoke. Senethorix spoke in a form even older that the Hungarian magister had spoken in life, that was related to the old form the way Latin is related to Sanskrit. Senethorix said, after the longest pause, accepted. Kethrim said accepted. Voralazar said accepted. He spoke the unbinding. He had memorized it. He had memorized it from a paragraph in Yarrow's manuscript, and from a fragment of a song the Baron had taught him in a corridor in October. The unbinding was a sequence of 43 syllables in the old form, organized in a meter that no living wizard could have improvised, but that he had memorized the way he had memorized Quidditch positions. The syllables had to be spoken in the dream link. They had to be spoken at the cadence of the consciousnesses. They had to be spoken with the breath in the place below the belly. He spoke them. He spoke them at the cadence. He spoke them with the breath. The web around the crystal trembled. The web around the crystal frayed at the 7th syllable. By the 15th it was a series of unjoined strands. By the 28th it was gone. The crystal was a clear case, undefended. By the 43rd syllable the crystal cracked in 3 places with the small clear sound of a glass under a finger. The 3 liches stepped out. They were tall. They were taller than living men. Kethrim was the tallest. He wore the form of a Saxon noble preserved past decay. His skin was the color of old vellum. His eyes were lamps. Voralazar wore the form of a Caucasian witch in robes the color of dried blood. Her hair was white and unbound. Her hands were long. Senethorix wore no stable form. He was a shape and then another shape and then a third, and he selected, for the convenience of being seen, the shape of a tall thin man with a beak of a nose and a robe of green silk older than the vault. They stood. They turned. They bowed to him. He stood in the dream link in the vault of the long sleep with 3 liches dead 8 centuries bowing to him, and he felt, in the place below the belly that he had been breathing into for 2.5 years, the click of a key turning in the second of 7 locks. He spoke. He said, rise from the vault, move by the channel I have opened, come to the place I will tell you, wait there. Do not be seen by any living, do not be heard by any living, do not be felt by any living, make of the night your shelter. They inclined. He named the place. He named a cave on the Scottish coast that he had read about in the restricted section and that had been used in the 8th century as a depot for things of this kind. The cave was unwarded. The cave was 100 miles from Hogwarts. The cave was, by his calculations, the only location within reasonable distance of his next operations that would not be detected when occupied. The 3 accepted the place. They moved. He let them move. He withdrew by the channel he had opened, back along the reservoir, back to the body in the dormitory in the tower at Hogwarts. He came back into the body. The body was wet with sweat. The body was sore. The body was in the muscles of the diaphragm and the throat, twitching with the cumulative strain of an extension that had lasted 7 hours by the clock on the table. He had been gone in the dream link no time. He had been gone in the room the whole night. He lay still. He waited until the breath had settled. He drank from the glass by the bed the water he had set out. He sat up. It was 4 a.m. The dormitory was full of the sound of his roommates breathing. Ron, 2 beds away, made a small noise in his sleep and turned over. The dormitory was utterly ordinary. Harry got out of bed. He stood at the window and looked at the grounds. In the grounds, below his window, in the cold grass, there was nothing that should not have been there. The grounds were ordinary. The night was ordinary. 100 miles north, in a cave on a coast that no human had visited in 3 centuries, 3 liches were stepping into a space they had not occupied since the year 1612. He thought in the precise interior voice, that is 2. He went back to bed. He slept until the morning bell. He went down to breakfast. At breakfast, Hermione, who had come back from the holidays the day before, looked at him over the toast. "You look terrible. I didn't sleep well. You look like you haven't slept in a week. It was a long night." She watched him. She said after a moment, "Harry, what? You're using up everything you have." He looked at her. "I know. There won't be anything left. There will be enough." She watched him for some time, then she ate her toast. She did not, as she had not at the entrance hall in June, press. He noted that the instrument between them was holding. He went to lesson. In potions, Snape made him brew a draught of peace, and Snape watched him brew it, and Snape did not say anything either approving or disapproving, and Harry filed the silence under. He knows I did something last night. He will not act on the knowledge. At lunch, the Baron passed him in the corridor outside the Great Hall and inclined his head a fraction lower than was usual and said, with the air of a man who had been waiting for a particular phrase, 3. 3, sir. That is 2, then. Yes, sir, the 3rd will require the veil. Yes, sir, you are not ready for the veil. I know, sir, you will be by Easter. Yes, sir. The Baron inclined his head once more and was gone. Harry went to charms. He did cheering charms. He did them well. He laughed when Hermione laughed. He answered Flitwick when Flitwick asked. He passed in the small mirror in the corridor afterward his own reflection, and noted that he had, by the discipline he had been practicing for 2.5 years, returned the face to the face the school expected. The face of a 15-year-old in a clandestine defensive magic study group, who was tired, who was burdened by the fact of Voldemort's return, who was nonetheless gamely getting on with his life and his lessons. He nodded to the reflection. He went on. 100 miles north, in the cave on the Scottish coast, Kethrim and Voralazar and Senithoric stood in the dark, and they did not move, and they did not speak, and they waited for the next instruction whose form they could not yet imagine, and which they would receive in time. Above them in the rock, the gulls cried in the cold spring afternoon, and the cold tide came in on the cold pebbles, and the wind, which had been blowing across the cove for 10,000 years without knowing what it had now begun to blow across, blew. In the days that followed the vault, he met 3 challenges he had not entirely anticipated. The first was the body. The body in the days after the dream link did not recover at the rate it had recovered after the forest. The reservoir had been extended past the boundary of its accustomed use, and the body that had carried the reservoir was, as bodies were, slow to admit that what had been done with it had been done. He woke for the next 4 mornings with a headache that did not respond to ordinary potions. He ran a low fever for 2 of them. Madame Pomfrey in the corridor on the 3rd morning asked him if he had been sleeping. He said yes. She did not believe him, which was acceptable, because she did not pursue it, which was also acceptable. He filed the observation under. The dream link is not a tool I can use weekly. It is a tool I can use perhaps 4 times a year at most without consequence. The second challenge was Sirius. Sirius had been at number 12 Grimmauld Place since the autumn, where the Order had installed him for his safety and from where he was not permitted to leave. Sirius had been writing to Harry through the Order's owls. Sirius had been writing more frequently than the Order knew. Sirius had been, by the cold first week of February, in a state of constrained anger that any boy with a godfather would have recognized. Sirius had also, since the night on the platform at King's Cross, been the one adult who knew. He had not been told. He had read it on Harry's face. He had then, in the months that followed, by an unobtrusive process of inquiry, questions slipped into letters, questions slipped into conversations through the fire when he could find a fire to speak through, questions slipped into the margins of items he sent, accumulated enough fragments to assemble a picture. The picture was incomplete. The picture was nonetheless correct in its outlines. Sirius had, in February, sent Harry a letter through Hedwig that contained one sentence: "You are doing what your mother's brother could not." Harry had read it, he had burned it, he had thought in the precise interior voice, "My mother had a brother, he was a wizard. He did something my godfather will not name in writing." He filed the question under "Ask Helena." He did not ask Helena yet, he wrote back yes, he did not elaborate. Sirius's next letter contained nothing but a passage from a poem Harry did not recognize, marked with a single underline under the line, "Keep your counsel even from those who love you until the year is in." Harry had read the line 3 times, he had burned it, he filed Sirius under, "The only adult who knows enough to be useful and not enough to be dangerous. Cultivate." The third challenge was Voldemort. Voldemort had been in his head increasingly since November. It had not been a steady invasion, it had been a series of pulses. He would feel in the middle of a meal a flicker of another person's emotion overlaid on his own. He would feel in the middle of a lesson a glimpse of a corridor he had never seen. He would dream 2 or 3 nights a week of a long room with green curtains and a fire that had not been put out in months. He had recognized the room. The room was at number 12 Grimmauld Place. He had told no one of the recognition. The pulses were not, he understood, intentional. Voldemort did not yet know he had a channel into Harry's mind. Voldemort knew only that something had been waking in him since the cauldron in the graveyard, and that the something had begun in the months since to leak. Voldemort was investigating the lake. Voldemort would, in time, recognize what the leak was, and when he did, he would attempt to use it. Harry was prepared for the attempt. He had been prepared since the hospital wing. He had walled the channel in the autumn with the discipline he had been refining since 3rd year, the discipline of holding the surface of his mind steady in the presence of an external attention. He had walled it more thoroughly in the winter, with the techniques Yarrow had described for separating the channel of the talent from the channel of ordinary thought. He had walled it again in February after the vault with a method of his own devising. He had let a portion of the residue, the piece of Voldemort he carried, come into a particular small room of his mind, and he had then sealed the small room around it, on the theory that a piece of Voldemort that thought it was at home in him would not generate the alarm a piece looking for him would generate. The seal had held. It had held with one consequence. The consequence was that the room in his sleep sometimes spoke to him. It spoke in the voice of a young man Harry had not met but whose voice he recognized by inheritance. The voice of Tom Riddle, age 16, the year of the chamber. It said small things. It said, "You're getting better." It said, "Snape thinks you are an idiot." It said, "Umbridge is not worth your trouble." It said, "Do not be afraid of the veil." Harry, in the room behind the seal, did not answer. He let the voice speak. He noted what it said. He noted, in particular, the matter of the veil. He filed it, "The piece of him that is Riddle wants me to go to the veil. The piece of him that is Riddle knows that I will need to." Riddle knew something about the veil that he never wrote down. The vault was the 2nd of 7. The veil will be the 3rd. He waited. In the meantime, Umbridge did what Umbridge did. She established the inquisitorial squad, which Harry registered as a list of students whose movements he would now need to track. She required the public reading of educational decrees, which Harry registered as a body of pretexts on which she could now expel any student in the building. She instituted the use in detention of a quill that wrote in the writer's own blood, a black quill of a kind Harry had read about in the restricted section and known to be illegal in 7 jurisdictions. She gave Harry one such quill on a Thursday evening. He wrote with it. He wrote as required, "I must not tell lies." He wrote it 200 times. He noted on the 100th repetition that the quill drew from his blood the precise quantity it required, neither more nor less, and that the cut on the back of his hand did not heal in the ordinary way. He noted on the 150th repetition that the cut had developed beneath the inked words a faint impression of something other than blood. He noted on the 200th repetition that what was beneath the words was a thin gray film he recognized from the bestiaries of his 2nd year, the residue of a binding intended not for him, but for whatever in him would later try to write something other than what Umbridge had required. He recognized the binding for what it was. It was a charm. It was a charm that would, in time, make him incapable of saying certain sentences aloud, on the assumption that he would, in time, be required to say them. He did not break the binding. He did not need to break it. Binding was keyed to the Harry Potter who had written the sentence 200 times in his own blood, which was a Harry Potter who had been, in the moment of writing, holding still on the surface of his mind. The Harry Potter under the surface, the Harry Potter who had been bound to 3 liches a week earlier, was not the Harry Potter the binding had bound. The charm would attach. It would not function. He filed it under, a useful demonstration of the inadequacy of the Ministry's understanding of what I am. He let the cut on his hand heal in its own time. Hermione noticed the cut on the second day. She made him sit. She asked him what it said. He read it for her. I must not tell lies. She read it again herself, with the silence she reserved for the rage she would not yet release. She did not speak for some time, then she said, I will kill her. He said with the levelness that had become his ordinary register, You will not have to. She looked at him. She said after a moment, All right. He understood in the moment that she had moved one notch closer to the place she had agreed not to cross. He filed it. He went on. In the second week after the vault, he received, in the small hours of a Wednesday morning, the first of what would prove to be his serial reports from the cave on the Scottish coast. The reports came through the channel he had opened at the vault. They did not come in words, they came in registrations, brief presences of the three minds against the perimeter of his own in the seconds before sleep, with the texture of a butler entering a room to confirm that the candles were lit. The report said, We are where we were told to be. The cave is intact. We have not been seen. We await. He acknowledged them. He acknowledged them by a small pressure of the reservoir back along the channel, a return greeting, no more, and the three minds withdrew. He had not yet given them instructions. He had not yet needed to. They had been bound. The binding implied the right to be sent. They knew that the sending would come. They could wait in the cave indefinitely. They had been waiting in the vault for 8 centuries. They had patience. On the second Sunday of March he met the Baron in the dungeon corridor. The Baron was waiting for him in the wall. You have rested. Yes, sir. The next is the veil. Yes, sir. You will not enter the department by the dream link. You will enter it bodily. You will enter at the moment Voldemort believes he has lured you in. You will enter through the door he will give you the way to. You will use his trap as your entrance. Yes, sir. You will not, in advance of that night, tell anyone. Yes, sir. You will not tell Sirius. He had not expected the order. Beat before answering. Why, he said, the Baron's pale eyes did not move. Because Sirius will come. Yes, sir, and because Sirius is not a man who can stand outside a fight to which his godson has gone alone. Sirius will come and Sirius will die unless you have arranged the night so that he does not come. You will arrange the night so that he does not come. You will manage it by the discipline you have been practicing. You will not tell him about the veil. You will not tell him about the lure. You will, if necessary, lie to him. He thought about this for some time. He thought about Sirius's letters. He thought about the dog on the platform. He thought about the 5th rule which forbade him from loving what he raised. He thought finally in the precise interior voice, the 5th rule does not apply here. Sirius is not raised. Sirius is alive. The 5th rule is about a different kind of love. The love that is between Sirius and me is the love that has to survive what I am going to do. To preserve it I will have to do the thing the Baron is asking, which is the thing the love requires. He said, Yes, sir. The Baron inclined his head. You are learning, he said. The lesson of the line of the eldest brother is that the line learns. The brothers were 3 because the line learns by triangulation. You have learned the first leg in the forest. You have learned the second in the vault. The third will be in the veil. The third will be the leg that makes you what you are. Yes, sir, Mr. Potter. Yes, sir. The third will hurt. He held the Baron's eye. I know, sir. The Baron inclined his head once more and was gone. Harry stood alone in the dungeon corridor. He breathed. He thought in the precise interior voice, the third will hurt because the third is the veil, and the veil is not a vault. The vault was crystal and law. The veil is a boundary not made by any wizard. The veil is older than wizards. To call the wraiths out of the veil is to ask a question of a structure that does not answer to the talent in the same way the dead in a glade or the consciousnesses in a vault answer to it. The veil will require me to extend the talent past the boundary of what the talents books have described. I will be in extending it, the first since the eldest brother to have asked the question the veil is the answer to. He thought, I will do it. He thought, I will do it because if I do not do it, the third leg of the line will not be in place, and without the third leg, I will not be in a position to undertake what I have to undertake by the end of next year. He thought, I have 3 months until the date Voldemort will choose, which by the structure of the trap will be the night of the 5th year examinations, when the school is at its most distracted and the Department of Mysteries is at its quietest. He thought, I have 3 months to be ready. He went up to the tower. He slept. He dreamed. In the dream he was in a long stone room he had not seen before. The room had a dais. The dais had an arch. The arch had a curtain of gray that moved as though there were a wind on the other side. There was no wind in the room. He stood at the foot of the dais. He looked at the curtain. The curtain moved. He thought in the dream and outside it at once, there are voices. He listened. He could not make out the voices. They were too far. They were too many. They had been speaking in the room beyond for as long as the room had existed. He turned. In the dream behind him stood the 3 liches. They had walked through stone to reach the dream room. They stood as he had left them in the cave, Kethrim tallest, Voralazar in her dried blood robe, Senethorix in his selected shape. They were looking at the curtain. They knew what was beyond it. They had been wizards of the talent in their lifetimes. They had not gone past the curtain at their deaths. They had used the lesser talent to remain on this side. The curtain was to them the threshold they had refused. He looked at them. He said in the dream, in the old form, I will go through. Senethorix said, not bodily. Voralazar said, not yet. Kethrim said, but you will call through it. He said, yes. Kethrim said, when? He said, in 3 months. They inclined. He woke. He sat up. The dormitory was as it had been. The dorm bell had not rung. The light at the window was the gray before dawn. He sat for a long time with the dream organized in his head, and he understood that the dream had been a briefing, and he understood that the briefing had come not from Voldemort but from the 3 liches he had liberated, who had now begun to use the channel he had opened to them for purposes consistent with their binding. He filed the use as appropriate. He went to breakfast. He sat between Ron and Hermione. Hermione looked at him. Better night, yes, good. He ate. In the corridor outside the great hall, the dead were going about their business, and as he passed, 3 of the older ghosts inclined their heads to him in the small, precise bow that had now been the practice of the castle's dead for 2.5 years. He inclined his head in return. He went to lessons. 100 miles north in the cave on the Scottish coast, the 3 liches stood in their dark and did not move, and the gulls cried, and the tide came in, and the wind blew, and nothing in the world above them yet knew what stood beneath the rock, and nothing yet would, for as long as the talent that had bound them did not require otherwise. Chapter 4 End. Chapter 5 The WRAITHS called from the veil. The veil had been described, in the literature available to him, as a doorway. The literature was incorrect. He read 3 further accounts in March and April, Yarrow's manuscript again, the unpublished memoir of an unspeakable who had killed himself in 1908, and a single chapter of a French treatise from 1654 that had survived only because it had been bound by error into a book on the propagation of mandrakes, and he understood by Easter that the veil was not a doorway. The veil was a threshold. The distinction was not pedantic. A doorway was a feature of an architecture. The architecture predated it. A threshold was the boundary between 2 architectures. The veil was the line at which the architecture of the living gave way to the architecture of whatever was on the other side. What was on the other side was not, as the ministry believed, a country. What was on the other side was a chorus. He understood this from the French treatise. The author had been a wizard who had in his youth stood at the veil for 1 minute and listened, and who had, in the chapter that survived, written down what he had heard. He had not been able to write the words. He had written, instead, what the words had been about. He had written that the words had been about every death every human had ever undergone, sung at once in a polyphony of staggering precision, by every voice the deaths had been of. The chorus had been continuous for as long as there had been deaths. The chorus would continue for as long as there were to be. The chorus, he wrote, was the address from which the dead spoke. The veil was the threshold at which the address became audible. A wizard who had the talent of the eldest brother could, in theory, do 2 things at the veil. He could listen, he could call. The first was the more dangerous. To listen at the veil with the talent was to admit the chorus into the body of one's own attention. The chorus would, in a wizard without the talent, deafen and madden in equal proportion. In a wizard with the talent it would, the French author had written, do something different and worse. It would reorganize the wizard's own death into the chorus, in advance of the wizard's having died. The wizard would not die. The wizard would simply find after that he had been written into the chorus, and that the address from which the dead spoke now included him, and that he was now living a posthumous life in a body that had not yet died. Harry filed this under, do not listen at the veil. The second use was the call. The call was the operation Harry had been preparing for since the vault. The call was the address, by name and authority, of a particular subset of the chorus. It was the request, not the command. The threshold did not respond to command, that those of the chorus who had not yet fully entered the chorus, the ones whose voices were thinnest, the wraiths, return to this side of the threshold and stand in his service. The wraiths were a class. They were not, as the textbooks suggested, an angry kind of ghost. They were the dead whose death had been so violent or so unfinished that they had not yet joined the chorus. They lingered at the threshold. They could, in the right voice, be brought back. There were said to be, at any given time, perhaps 1,000 wraiths on the threshold of the veil. Most were ancient, some were recent, none were of any single nation or kind. They had been in life soldiers, witches, condemned men, children dead of plague, suicides, sailors lost at sea. They had no allegiance. They had a quality. The quality was the unfinished nature of their death. If he called them, he could, in principle, bring them back. If he bound them, they would be his. If he failed to bind them, if the calling reached but the binding did not hold, they would be free, and they would be on this side of the veil, and they would be furious, and they would set about doing whatever it was the unbound wraiths of the veil set about doing, which was a thing the literature did not describe because no living wizard had ever survived to describe it. He read this twice. He set the manuscript down. He thought in the precise interior voice that had become his daily companion, the calling and the binding will have to be performed in a single act, without interval, without breath between them. The binding will have to be ready before the calling begins. Wraiths cannot be brought back and held in a holding pattern while I prepare a binding. The moment they are this side of the veil, they must be mine. He spent April and most of May on the binding. He drafted it in 3 forms. He revised each form 3 times. He tested each revision in his head against the recorded behaviors of unbound shades, against the Baron's drilled rules, against the green leather book's diagrams, against the Latin of the monk's letters and the more antique Latin of the French treatise. He used Hermione's tutoring book on arithmancy, the one she did not know he was reading, to verify that the meter of the binding satisfied the prosodic conditions the talent required. He arrived on the 17th of May at a final form. The final form was a sequence of 112 syllables in the old form, organized in a meter that no human language had ever used for any purpose other than this one. It included 3 names that no living wizard knew because they had been forgotten before the statute. The names were of 3 of the original 11 principles of the talent. He had reconstructed them from a fragment of a song the Baron had taught him in November. He memorized the binding. He memorized it as he had memorized the unbinding for the vault. He memorized it so that when the time came he would not have to think about it, he would only have to breathe. He spent the last week of May on the rest was logistics. The night was the 5th of June. The ministry's examination schedule for Hogwarts had been published in late April. He had memorized it. The owls would conclude on the 4th. The DA had broken up in March under Umbridge's pressure. Formally, informally, it remained, and would be available to him as cover for any movement that needed it. Sirius was at Grimmauld Place. The order was, by his observation, at its thinnest in late spring. Most members had returned to their day jobs while the school operated, and the rota in Diagon Alley had been reduced. Voldemort would, by the calendar of his own operations, choose the 5th or the 6th of June. The 5th was the better night by his lights because it gave him the cleaner 48 hours before the order would be in a position to muster a response. Harry counted on Voldemort choosing the 5th. He had, by mid-May, designed his own night around the 5th. His own night had 3 phases. Phase 1 would be the entrance to the Department of Mysteries, under the lure Voldemort would supply, the false vision of Sirius in danger. Harry would let himself be lured. He would let himself be taken to the department by the route Voldemort had arranged. He would not bring his friends. He would, as the Baron had ordered, lie to Sirius and to Ron and to Hermione, by selection and by silence in the days before, so that none of them would follow him. He had begun the lying. It had not been difficult. It had cost him in another currency. He had paid the currency without flinching. Phase 2 would be the veil. He would, in the gap between Voldemort's arrival and the Order's arrival, for the Order would, of course, arrive. Harry had calculated this. Dumbledore would have a watch on Sirius and would notice Sirius's leaving and would apparate the order to the department within 12 minutes. He would enter the veil room. He would perform the calling. He would perform the binding. He would be done in 9 minutes, allowing a margin of 3. Phase 3 would be the deployment. The deployment was Chapter 6 in his plan. He had not yet decided whether it would occur on the same night or whether he would withdraw and deploy later. The Baron had recommended same night. Harry had been inclined the same way. He had not, however, finalized the decision. He wished to see the configuration in the atrium before he committed. The lying had a shape. He had begun in April to drop, in conversation with Hermione, the small notes of a boy more burdened by Voldemort's return than the year had let on. He had let her see, when she was watching, brief flickers of distress he did not let himself feel. He had let Ron catch him, twice, awake at 3 in the morning, with a book on the table that did not look as if he had been reading it. He had been preparing them, by these accumulations, for the night on which he would let himself be seen to crack. The night was the 5th of June. They would, by his calibration on that night, believe what they saw. They would believe it because he had been laying the conditions for belief for 2 months. He had also been managing Sirius. Sirius, since February, had been writing 2 letters a week. The letters had been, on their surface, the letters of a godfather to his godson. Beneath the surface, they had been the inquiries of a man putting together a picture from fragments. Harry had answered them with the discipline he had been refining since the hospital wing, supplying, in each reply, enough material to confirm Sirius's growing thesis, without confirming what Sirius did not yet need to know. Sirius's thesis by the end of April was approximately the right thesis. Sirius understood that Harry had since 3rd year been undergoing a change neither Dumbledore nor the Order had identified. He understood that the change was a magical capacity of an order Sirius had not himself encountered. He understood that the capacity was, to those who would learn of it, alarming. He did not understand the precise category. He had not been to the restricted section. He had not read Mowbray. He suspected when pressed that Harry was developing an unusual proficiency with the animagus discipline or with the more restricted varieties of defense. He had not arrived at necromancy because he had not been given the data that would have led him there. Harry had given him no further data. In the last week of April, Sirius had written a letter that contained 4 sentences. I will not ask you what it is. I will not ask you to stop. I will ask you only to tell me if I can be in any way useful. I will be ready. Harry had read the letter twice. He had burned it. He had written back, yes, be ready, not yet. He had not told Sirius what Sirius would be ready for. He had not in particular told Sirius about the 5th of June. The omission had cost him something. He had paid the cost in advance on a Sunday evening in early May, while Hermione had been in the library and Ron had been at Quidditch practice. He had sat on the windowsill of the dormitory and let himself, for the first time since the hospital wing, feel what the omission would feel like to Sirius when Sirius, on the 5th, would discover it. He had let the feeling occupy him for 16 minutes. He had then stood up, washed his face, gone down to dinner, and not let the feeling reoccupy him again. He filed the discipline under. The cost of cultivating Sirius is the periodic permission to feel what he will feel. In the same period, he had been managing Dumbledore. Dumbledore had begun, in March, to look at him differently. The difference had been visible in the eyes of the portraits of Dumbledore's predecessors, which Harry had glimpsed once through a half-open door, and which had been watching him in the corridor as he passed. The difference had been visible in the rote a Dumbledore had assigned to the order. The watchers on number 4 Privet Drive had been re-rotated such that Lupin had now drawn the most shifts, and Lupin had been instructed. Harry had inferred this from the tone of a conversation he overheard between Lupin and Tonks in March, to attempt, in casual interactions over the summer holidays, to assess Harry's mental state. Dumbledore had not, however, called Harry into his office. This was the data point Harry attended to most. Dumbledore had had, in the last 2 years, half a dozen occasions on which he could have called Harry in and asked. He had not. He had decided on each occasion to wait. The waiting was, Harry believed, Dumbledore's chosen strategy. He had calculated that to ask too early would cost him more than to wait until Harry himself volunteered, and he had calculated further that Harry would, in time, volunteer. Harry would not volunteer. He had, in this calibration, departed from Dumbledore's projection, and Dumbledore had not yet detected the departure. The departure would, Harry calculated, be detected at the latest on the morning of the 6th of June, when Dumbledore would arrive at the ministry and would see what had been done in the atrium overnight, and would be required then to revise his model of his student in a direction he had not been preparing for. Harry had begun in May to prepare for the conversation that would follow. He had not prepared a script, he had prepared instead a posture. The posture was, I have done what I have done, I will not be reasoned out of it, I will not be lectured out of it, I will not be moved out of it. You may have what authority you have at this school for as long as you wish to exercise it. I will not contest your authority, I will also not surrender mine. He had practiced the posture in private by himself in the mirror. He had found that he could hold it. He had found, more usefully, that holding it did not require him to feel anything in particular. The posture was a position, not an emotion. Holding it was holding a stance. He had filed it under, ready. In the 2nd week of May, Snape had requested an additional occlumency session. The session had been short. Snape had not used the wand. Snape had sat in his office behind his desk and looked at Harry for some minutes without speaking. Then Snape had said, Potter, sir, whatever you are preparing to do, you will do it in such a way that the school does not, on the morning after, find itself unable to continue functioning. Yes, sir, you understand that the alternative is one in which the school does not continue functioning. Yes, sir, that alternative is unacceptable. Yes, sir, then we agree. Yes, sir, Snape had nodded once. He had dismissed Harry. He had not requested another session. Harry had walked back to the tower thinking about the conversation. He had concluded, after some thought, that Snape had given him the most useful piece of information of the year. Snape had told him, without telling him, that what was about to happen would happen, and that no one in the school had standing to prevent it, and that the only consideration available to those who knew was the operational one of containing the damage. Snape had communicated further that he, Snape, would not impede. Harry had filed Snape under, a teacher who has chosen to be useful within the limits of his ability and his conscience. He had let the file rest. He had not, in those weeks, returned to the deep glade. The matriarch was holding the forest contingent at the perimeter. He felt them daily in their position. They were ready. He He would call them on the night by the channel. They would walk through the flue at the Hog's Head to a point Harry had prearranged with an obliging ghost in the Diagon Alley wall, and they would surface in the central rotunda of the Ministry exactly 40 seconds before the wraiths came up out of the atrium floor. He had timed it. He had timed it on parchment in his own hand in the tower at 2 in the morning of the 23rd of May, and he had burned the parchment, and the timing was now in his head, and the timing would not change. He had visited twice the cave on the Scottish coast in dream. The 3 liches had not spoken at the first visit. They had stood. He had inspected their condition. Their condition was acceptable. They had been waiting 8 centuries in a vault. 3 months in a cave was to them an unremarkable interval. At the second visit they had spoken. Kethrim had said the night. Harry had said the 5th. Voralazar had said the place. Harry had said the atrium of the Ministry of Magic in London. Senethorix had said whom. Harry had said the woman who killed the eldest brother's last documented descendant, who is called Bellatrix, who is the cousin of my godfather, the wizard who funded the operation that produced the cauldron, who is called Lucius, who is the father of a boy in my year, the others as you find them. Kethrim had inclined. Voralazar had inclined. Senethorix had said the WRAITHS. Harry had said the wraiths will take the survivors. Senethorix had said it is enough. He had withdrawn. He had returned to the body. He had paid the cost, a day of headaches, an evening of nausea, and had then gone on with the school. He completed the owls. He completed them in the upper second tier. He chose for the practical defense exam a sequence of charms calibrated to demonstrate competence without flair. He cast a patronus which he had been working on through the year. The patronus in the examiner's room took, for the first time, a fixed form. The form was not an animal. The form was a tall, thin shape in a hood that hovered without face, and the examiner had not known what to make of it, and had marked it as a patronus on the grounds that it was silver and dispersed Dementors in the test booth, and had not asked further questions. Harry had left the room and walked the corridor and not laughed. He took the history of magic exam in the afternoon of the 5th in the great hall with the rest of the school. He took the exam with his quill on the parchment and his mind on the parchment and his attention on the dates of Goblin Wars he had been studying in their primary sources for 2 years and could have lectured on. The exam was easy. In the middle of the exam he experienced the lure. The lure came in as he had expected, a flash of the long stone room with the dais and the arch, overlaid on his own field of vision with the figure of Sirius bound at the foot of the dais and Voldemort standing over him with a wand at his throat. The flash was vivid. The flash was, by Voldemort's lights, very persuasive. Harry registered the flash. He registered the falsity. He registered the location. He put his quill down. He let his face go pale. He let his hand, in the standard tell of 5th-year examinees who were having a vision they ought not to have had, come up to his scar. He stood up. He walked out of the exam hall. He let himself in the corridor outside be agitated. He let McGonagall find him and ask what was wrong. He let himself in the room McGonagall took him to, refuse to explain. He let, in the precise calibration of moments he had rehearsed, the necessary minutes pass in which the false alarm would have time to take hold of him in the public sense without anyone having time to fetch Dumbledore. He let Hermione find him. He told Hermione what he had seen. He told it as he had rehearsed it, with the conviction of a boy who had not been bound to 3 liches in February, and who was therefore terrified for his godfather and prepared to do something foolish. Hermione, as he had calculated, said she would come. He said it with the precise warmth a friend who is determined to go alone uses on a friend who is determined to come. He said it with the small lift in the voice that suggests the speaker is barely holding himself together. He said it with the kindness that lets the friend accept the number Hermione did not accept the number he had calculated this to. He let her come in plan. He let Ron come in plan. He let, when she insisted on her, Luna come, and Neville and Ginny. He let them come in plan only to the front door of the Department of Mysteries. There, by a feature of the architecture he had memorized from Hambrook, the entrance hall would offer them a series of doors. The first door they would open would, by Hambrook's appendix on contingencies, drop them into the time-locked room on the second sub-level. The room was not dangerous. It would hold them for 45 minutes by their own subjective clock and approximately 3 minutes by the clock of the rest of the department, after which they would be released into the central rotunda, where the order would by then have arrived and would collect them. Harry had arranged it. He had in the second week of May gone, by Dreamlink, briefly, at considerable cost, into the department and made a small adjustment to the rotation of the entrance hall, such that the first door any party of unauthorized entrance would open would be the time-locked room. He had returned with a headache that had lasted 2 days. The adjustment had held. Hermione would not on the night take her friends through the door that led to the Veil room. Harry would take that door alone. He left the school with the others at the appointed hour by the Thestrals he had told them they could ride. They could not, in fact, see the Thestrals. The Thestrals could see him. The Thestrals knew him by what he was. The Thestrals carried him with the precision of horses that recognized the rider was not strictly riding. They flew to London. They landed at the Ministry. He went down with the others through the visitors' entrance, which Voldemort had unlocked for him. He went down to the 9th floor. He stood in the entrance hall of the Department of Mysteries with Ron and Hermione and Luna and Neville and Ginny, and he let them open the first door, and the first door dropped them into the time-locked room exactly as he had arranged. He registered their disappearance. He registered in himself the sliver of feeling he had set aside to register. The sliver was sorrow. The sorrow was for the deception. The sorrow was finite. He let it pass. He turned to the second door. He opened it. He went through a corridor. He went through a second corridor. He came to the Veil room. The Veil room was as the French treatise had described it. It was long. It was high. It was made of black stone. The dais at the end was higher than Hambrook had recorded. Hambrook had been working from a plan a century before the dais had been raised. The arch on the dais was simple. The curtain in the arch was gray. The curtain moved as if there were a wind on the other side. There was no wind in the room. The room was empty of the living. The room was full of attention. He felt the attention as he stepped onto the marble of the floor. It was not the attention of the chorus. The chorus did not pay attention to individuals from the far side. The attention was nearer. It was the attention of those who were not yet of the chorus, the wraiths at the threshold, who had been there all along and who, now that he had stepped into the room, had begun in the way they had to register him. He walked to the foot of the dais. He did not look at the curtain. He did not, in this first phase, listen. He breathed. He breathed below the belly. He found the reservoir. The reservoir, after 3 months of preparation, was at the highest pitch it had ever reached. It was full. It was past full. It had been, by his calibration, primed for this night since the equinox. He let the breath rise. He let the voice come up out of the reservoir. He spoke. He spoke the calling. The calling was 40 syllables in the old form. The 40 syllables were not, strictly speaking, words. They were names. They were the names of the 3 principles he had reconstructed from the Baron's song, joined by the connectives of the form, and they constituted, when spoken with the breath, the address by which the chorus was named in its capacity to release what had not yet joined it. He spoke the calling. The curtain trembled. The curtain trembled in a way curtains do not tremble. The curtain rolled briefly, sideways and then back. The curtain became, for one moment, transparent. Through the transparency he saw what was on the other side. He saw not a country. He saw the chorus. The chorus was a vast unlit space in which there were no faces and there were no bodies and there were only voices. And the voices were singing the polyphony of every death that had ever been, and the polyphony was the address from which the dead spoke, and the polyphony was, in its arrangement, precisely as the French author had described it 350 years before. He did not listen. He had been warned. He did not let his attention follow the polyphony. He let his attention remain on the syllables he was speaking, on the breath below his belly, on the room around him, on the dais at his feet. He spoke the rest of the calling. He spoke the binding immediately after, without breath. The binding was 112 syllables. He spoke them in the meter he had memorized. He spoke them with the names of the 3 principles included in their proper places. He spoke them with the breath descending and ascending in the cadence the talent required. The curtain at the threshold opened. It did not open as a door. It opened as a stage. The gray of the curtain parted to a depth, and the depth filled with figures, and the figures came forward. They came one at a time at first. The first was a woman in armor from a war so old it had no name. Her armor was the bronze of the late Mycenaean period. Her face was a face. Her face had been waiting at the threshold for 3,000 years. She crossed it. She came down the dais. She stopped at the foot. She bowed. The second was a man in a tunic of plant fiber. He had been, in life, a Pacific Islander. He had been killed by his own brother over a fishing dispute. He had been waiting 800 years. The third was a child. He had not expected the child. He registered the child without letting the registration affect the breath. The child was perhaps 6. She was wearing the dress of a 14th-century plague death. Her face had the resignation of someone who had been waiting 600 years for someone to call her. She crossed. She came down. She stood at the foot. After the child, the others came faster. They came in 10s. They came in 20s. They came in groups he did not bother to count. The figures filled the foot of the dais. They filled the floor. They spread in a slow circle outward from the foot of the dais until the entire room held them, and the room was no longer empty of the living because what was in it was, technically, alive, and the room was no longer empty of the dead because what was in it was technically dead, and the room was full of an order of being he had read about for 2 years and was now standing in. He counted very roughly 300. He continued to speak. He spoke the closing of the binding. The closing was 20 syllables. The 20 syllables sealed the binding. They named, by the principles, the obligation he had now incurred and the obligation they had now incurred. The obligation was mutual. He would, by the closing, owe them, and they would, by the closing, owe him. He spoke the closing. The curtain settled, the threshold sealed. The chorus on the other side did not stop. The chorus had not stopped in the duration of any human death. The chorus would not stop. The polyphony continued behind the curtain in the same unbroken arrangement it had been continuing in for as long as there had been deaths. He breathed. He looked at the 300. The 300 looked at him. He said in the old form with the throat now sore, "Hear me." They heard. He said, "You are bound. The binding is the binding I have spoken. You will be sent. The sending will be tonight. The sending will be a fight. The fight will be against those who serve a wizard who has not learned what we know. After the fight you will be released to the places I will name. You will hold those places until I call you. You will not be seen. You will not be heard. You will, until I call you, exist in the silence appropriate to your binding." They inclined. He said, "I am the line." They inclined more deeply. He said, "Rise to the atrium. Wait in the dark. Wait until the trap that has been set for me has sprung. Wait until the Death Eaters have come. Then come up out of the floor. Take them." They moved. They did not walk in the ordinary sense. They moved through the marble of the floor and through the walls and through the ceilings of the Department of Mysteries as wind moves through reeds. They were in motion, and then they were gone from the veil room, and they were at the levels above, dispersed through the structure of the ministry, in positions he had specified by the Hambrook coordinates he had memorized in the dark beneath the lobby in the atrium, where they would wait for the Death Eaters to arrive in the position the trap required, and where they would, at his signal, ascend. He stood alone in the veil room. He breathed. He looked at his hands. His hands were shaking. He registered the shaking. He registered in his chest the cost of the calling and the binding and the holding. He registered that the cost would be paid in the next 12 hours and that he would, by the end of the next day, lie in bed for a week. He filed it. He left the veil room. He walked through the corridor. He came back to the entrance hall. He stood for a moment in the entrance hall. He thought about Hermione in the time-locked room, who would be released into the rotunda in approximately 7 minutes. He thought about Ron, who would have spent the 7 minutes complaining. He thought about Luna, who would have spent the 7 minutes describing the room to the others with the unhurried precision Luna brought to all things. He thought about Sirius at Grimmauld Place, whom he had told he was, that afternoon, going to study with Hermione and who would by now be discovering by an alarm Dumbledore had set on the house to monitor his godson's location, that Harry was not at Hermione's house, and was not, in fact, at Hogwarts, and was at the Ministry. He thought, Sirius will come. He thought, I have prepared for that. He thought, the wraiths at the atrium know my godfather by his line, because his line has been entered in the binding. They will not touch him. He thought, but Sirius will see them. He thought, Sirius will be among the first of the living to see what I have done. He thought, I will deal with that after. He walked into the atrium. The atrium was empty. The fireplaces along the walls were unlit. The fountain in the center was dark. The marble of the floor was the floor he had stood on at the age of 12 when he had first come to the Ministry with Mr. Weasley. The hall was the hall. Above him, in the silence, he could feel the wraiths in the structure. He could feel 300 minds, in the position he had set them, waiting. He could feel, further north, the 3 liches in the cave, who had been called along the channel earlier in the evening, and who had begun, by the same channel, to move south toward London at the speed of beings whose movement was governed by no body. He could feel in the forest the matriarch at the head of the 40-odd inferi, who had been called along the 3rd channel and who were, by the matriarch's careful management, walking the long path from the deep glade toward the edge of the trees, where they would wait for the further call to come down. He could feel in himself the 3rd leg of the line complete. He stood in the empty atrium. He waited for Voldemort. In the last week before the night, the residue had spoken to him more often. It had spoken in the voice of Tom Riddle at 16, as it had since the autumn, but the tone had shifted. The tone had become collegial. The tone had become, in the small hours when he could not sleep, almost companionable. It said, "You are going to do it well." It said, "I would have done it differently, but I would have been wrong." It said, "I did not in my time find what you have found. I found the lower path. The lower path requires the Horcrux. The path you are on does not. I am sorry I did not find it." The voice was, by its own admission, surprised. Harry, in the small room behind the seal in his mind, did not answer it. He did not let it out of the room. He noted what it said. He filed it. The most useful thing the voice had said was, on the night of the 2nd of June, the following: "He will not understand what you are. He will see what you have done and he will not have a category for it. He will assume it is another wizard's work. He will assume Dumbledore. He will not believe you have done it yourself, because in his model of you there is no apparatus by which you could have. His error will be your advantage on the night. Harry had noted the advice. He had recognized that the voice was not, in this matter, lying. The voice had known Voldemort better than anyone now living, and had recognized from inside the limit of Voldemort's understanding of children. He had filed the advice. He had used it in the design of the night by leaving in the entrance to the department a single visible trace of the kind a more practiced wizard might have left, a faintly visible glow in the marble where he had stood. The glow was not his glow. It was a glamour he had drawn from a textbook on glamours and tuned to read, to Voldemort's senses, as the residue of Dumbledore's apparition. He had hoped by this to confirm Voldemort's assumption. On the morning of the 5th he had eaten breakfast. He had not eaten with appetite, he had eaten with discipline. Hermione had watched him eat. She had asked twice what was wrong. He had said twice, nothing. He had used, in the second saying, a degree of distress he had calibrated to suit the morning. She had not pressed. She had, however, looked at him with the eyes of someone who had been on the threshold of the question she had agreed not to ask, and who had now decided to ask it that night, after the history of magic exam, when she could get him alone in the common room. He had registered the decision. He had filed it. He had thought, in the precise interior voice, she will not get the chance. By the time she gets to the common room I will be gone. By the time I am back the question will no longer be the one she had decided to ask. He had been correct in both predictions. At lunch he had passed Ginny in the corridor outside the Great Hall. She had been carrying her bag of books over her shoulder. She had stopped him. "You look bad. I'm tired." She had watched him. She had said after a beat, "Is it tonight?" He had not answered. She had nodded once as if his silence had been a confirmation and walked on. He had stood in the corridor for a moment after. He had filed Ginny under. She will be one of those I will eventually have to tell. She has earned the eventual telling. Not yet. He had gone to lessons. The exam had begun at 2. The lure had arrived at 3. He had been on the road to London by 3:30. He had stood in the atrium of the Ministry of Magic in the empty silence with 3 armies in their positions and 1 lure in motion against him at 7:14. He had waited. The atrium was very still. The fireplaces along the walls were unlit. The fountain in the center was dark. The marble of the floor was the floor he had stood on at the age of 12. He breathed below the belly. He felt the reservoir. He felt in the structure above and below, the wraiths and the liches and the matriarch with her 40. He thought, "I am 16 in 3 weeks. He thought, "I am the line." He thought, "The third leg of the line is complete." He thought, "The Dark Lord I will have to put down will not put down what I have brought." He thought, "Last begin." In the silence of the atrium, the green flame of the first of the fireplaces lit, and a figure in a hooded robe stepped out, and the figure raised a wand, and the figure said his name, and Harry, standing in the center of the marble, raised his head and let the atrium see him, and let the figure see him, and let everything that had been arranged for this hour come at last into its appointed motion. Chapter 5 End. Chapter 6 Voldemort retreats from the ministry. The figure in the hooded robe was Rookwood. Rookwood had been an unspeakable. Rookwood had, before his arrest at the close of the First War, worked the lower vaults of the Department of Mysteries. Rookwood was the Death Eater Voldemort had chosen to send first, because Rookwood would, if anyone in the atrium had been alarmed, be the one most quickly able to identify a magical defense, and because Voldemort had wished to send a competent man first in order to read the room. Rookwood saw a boy. He saw a boy alone on the marble, with his hands at his sides and no wand visible, and the green light of the fireplace fading at his back and the silence of the atrium ringing. Rookwood said, in the corrected voice of a man who has been told to confirm before acting, "Harry Potter." Harry inclined his head, the precise courtesy a sovereign extends to an envoy of a power he does not recognize. "Yes." Rookwood paused. The pause was the pause of a man who had been working for 40 years and who had developed in that working the discipline of waiting an additional second before acting, because the additional second was, by his experience, the difference between a clean operation and the kind of operation a man wrote up in a memo afterward for the rest of the office to laugh at. In the additional second, Rookwood read the room. He read the room incorrectly. He read it as a child standing alone in an empty hall. He read the marble, the dark fountain, the cold air, the absence of any visible defense. He did not read what was beneath the marble. He did not read what was in the structure above. He did not read what was in the boy. His training, which had been the training of the upper department, had not equipped him to read what was, in this case, the relevant data. Rookwood took a step forward. Harry let him take it. Rookwood took a second. Behind Rookwood, the other fireplaces lit, one after another in green, in the order Voldemort's plan had specified. The first to come through was Bellatrix Lestrange. The second was Lucius Malfoy. The third was Antonin Dolohov, and then Augustus Rookwood's brother, and then Travers and Macnair and Mulciber and Crabbe and Goyle, and a man Harry did not know whose face was scarred from temple to chin, and then the rest. They came in 12. They came in the formation Voldemort had drilled, in the half-moon that opened toward the lifts and that closed around the boy in the center. They were professional. They were not, in their professionalism, prepared. Harry breathed. He breathed below the belly. He did not speak in the old form. He did not need to. The 43 syllables of the calling had been spoken in the Veil Room an hour earlier. The 3 armies were in their positions. The activation was, for them, a single pressure of the reservoir, no more. He gave the pressure. The wraiths came up out of the marble. They came up in the way the literature had described, and the way the Death Eaters had not been prepared to see. They came up not as figures stepping through a wall, but as the marble itself developing voices, and the voices becoming visible. The marble of the atrium floor, that pale, polished, ancient stone, laid in the construction of the ministry in 1812 by goblin craftsmen who had been paid in gold for their work, rose, in places, into the shapes of the 300. The shapes rose to the height of men. The shapes rose to the height of giants. The shapes rose, in some cases, no higher than a child of 6 in the dress of a 14th-century plague death. They were silver in the atrium light. They were silver as deep water is silver. They surrounded the half-moon of Death Eaters. The Death Eaters turned. Rookwood the senior raised his wand. He cast. His casting was the casting of a man of 40 years of practical magic. It was stunning in the precise English that the ministry preferred. It was aimed with the precision of long habit at the wraith nearest him, the woman in Mycenaean armor who had been waiting at the threshold for 3,000 years. The stunner struck her. It passed through her. It struck the wall behind her. It cracked the marble of the wall behind her in a clean diagonal line a yard long. The woman in armor inclined her head. The woman in armor stepped forward. She did not raise a weapon because she did not need a weapon and because the binding had not been about weapons. She put her hand on Rookwood's chest. Her hand passed through his robe and through his ribcage and through his sternum and into the cavity behind it, and she closed her hand on what she had come for, which was the part of Rookwood that had not yet been ready to join the chorus, and she pulled. She pulled it free. Rookwood made a sound that was not, by the standards of human sounds, a sound. The sound was the sound of a soul leaving the throat that had housed it, in the seconds before the throat had decided it had been left. The throat, Rookwood's throat, did not fall. The body of Rookwood fell. The body fell as a body falls when the part of it that had been animating it had, by an external hand, been removed from it. The body hit the marble. The body did not move. The woman in armor held what she had taken in her closed hand, and the silver of her form had brightened by what she now held, and she stepped back into the row of the wraiths, and she stood, with her hand at her side, in the position of a soldier whose first task of the night had been completed. The half-moon of Death Eaters broke. It broke in the way professional formations break, when the thing they have come for has just been demonstrated to be a thing the formation has no answer to. Bellatrix Lestrange screamed. She screamed not in fear. She screamed in the particular registration of a woman who had spent 15 years in Azkaban developing a tolerance for surprises and who had in the present second met a surprise her tolerance had not been built to absorb. She raised her wand. She cast a curse Harry did not recognize. The curse was green. The curse was specific. The curse struck the nearest wraith, a man in a Roman legionary's tunic who had been waiting at the threshold for 2,000 years, and the wraith did not pass through. The wraith absorbed the curse, took the green into himself, and reissued it. He reissued it in the form of a long, thin tongue of green light that arrived at Bellatrix's left shoulder and held. Bellatrix did not then scream. She fell to her knees on the marble. The legionary stepped forward. He did not take her. He had been told by the channel of the binding that Bellatrix was not the wraith's to take. He stepped aside. Vorlazar walked through the wall. Vorlazar had been waiting in the structure of the atrium above, in the cavity between the 8th and 9th floors, for the moment the binding had specified. She walked through the marble of the wall as the wraiths walked through it, but where the wraiths were silver, she was dark. Her robe was the dried blood color it had been in the vault. Her white hair was unbound. Her hands were long. She walked across the marble of the atrium toward Bellatrix on the floor. Bellatrix saw her. Bellatrix's eyes, black, mad, intelligent, registered Vorlazar in the way the eyes of a hunting woman register in the field an animal she has not before encountered, and that is, by every signal of an order superior to her own. Bellatrix raised her wand. Bellatrix said the words of the killing curse. The killing curse left her wand in the green that the killing curse always left wands in. The curse struck Voralazar's chest. Voralazar absorbed it. Voralazar did not, as the legionary had, reissue it. Voralazar took the curse into herself and held it. She walked still across the marble. The curse smoldered in her robe like a coal in the wood of a hearth and did not extinguish and did not consume her, and she walked and she came to where Bellatrix was on her knees and she stopped. She looked down at Bellatrix. She spoke in the old form. She spoke in the form that had been the speech of the witches of the Caucasus in the centuries before the statute, the form in which death magic had been done, and prayer had been done, and the naming of children had been done. She said, "I have waited for one of your line." Bellatrix did not understand the syllables. Bellatrix understood the tone. Voralazar said, "Your line has killed mine. The last of your line that killed mine was a woman named Morgausc 400 years ago. I could not reach her from the vault. I can reach you." She put one of her long hands on the crown of Bellatrix's head. She did not pull as the woman in armor had pulled. She pressed. She pressed downward into the skull, not through the bone but through the structure of the consciousness behind the bone, and the structure was, for Bellatrix, the only structure she had built her life on, and the pressing was the pressing of a hand through a paper wall. Bellatrix's eyes went still. Bellatrix did not fall. Bellatrix stood on her knees with her hand on her wand and her face turned up toward Voralazar's face, and the eyes that had been mad and intelligent and black had become the eyes of a thing that had been made empty in less than a second by an attention that had been waiting 400 years to be paid. Voralazar withdrew her hand. Bellatrix tipped forward onto the marble. Bellatrix did not move again. Voralazar stepped back. She stepped back into the row of the wraith. She inclined her head slightly to Harry, who had not moved from the center of the marble, and who had registered the dispatch of Bellatrix with the dispassion he had registered, 3 years earlier, the dispatch of Cedric. Lucius Malfoy was, by then, 3 steps behind Bellatrix and trying to disengage. Lucius had been, in life and at this moment, a man of considerable acuity. Lucius had read the room in the second after the woman in armor had taken Rookwood, more correctly than Rookwood had read it. He had recognized, in the silvered figures rising from the marble, an order of being he had read about in the family library at Malfoy Manor in the books his grandfather had collected, and he had concluded accurately that the engagement his lord had sent him to was an engagement his lord had misread. Lucius had turned before Voralazar had reached Bellatrix toward the nearest fireplace. Lucius had not made the fireplace. Kethrim had come up out of the floor. Kethrim had been in the structure beneath the lifts, in the cavity between the marble and the goblin foundations, since the binding had been activated. He came up now. He came up to his full height, which was the height of a tall Saxon noble preserved past decay, and his lamps, his eyes, were lit. He came up between Lucius and the fireplace. Lucius stopped. Lucius's wand was in his hand. Lucius raised it. Lucius was, in his way, brave. He did not turn his back on the lick. He cast a curse Harry recognized, the one Lucius had used in his first task at the Department of Mysteries in the year of the diary, when he had been showing off in front of an audience, and which Harry had read about in a Daily Prophet report by Rita Skeeter. The curse was not the killing curse. The curse was a Lestrange family curse, the green flame curse that consumed what it struck, that had been in the literature classified as dark by the Ministry in 1721. The curse struck Kethrim. It did not consume him. It struck the form Kethrim wore and rolled, as the stunner had rolled off the wraith off the form. The flame of the curse subsided into the air. The marble around Kethrim's feet showed, briefly, a scorched patch where the flame had touched it. Kethrim spoke. He spoke in the old form. The form of his speech was the form Voralazar had used. The form was the speech the lick tongue had been before the lick tongue had been the only language those who spoke it spoke. He said, "I am Kethrim. I have been bound. I am bound to one whose line the line of Malfoy has never served. The line of Malfoy has, in 2 centuries, FUNDD 4 attempts on the line I serve. The latest was a wand, a coin, and a fire." Lucius's face did not change. His eyes, which had been on Kethrim, went briefly to Harry. He had read in the Lick's accusation what Kethrim had told him. He had understood that the wand, the coin, and the fire were the diary, the price Lucius had paid Pettigrew for the materials of the graveyard, and the operation Lucius had funded a month earlier against Privet Drive that had failed. Lucius did not then plead. He raised his wand and cast the killing curse. He cast it cleanly. He cast it with the precise calibration of a man whose life depended on the casting. The green arrived at Kethrim's chest in the line of fire it would have arrived had Kethrim been a wizard. The green did not strike. The green folded in the air around Kethrim and dispersed. Kethrim stepped forward. He raised his right hand. The hand was the color of vellum. The hand was long. The hand was in its proportions the hand of a man who had been a noble in life and who had been a lick for 8 centuries. He put the hand on Lucius's throat. He did not press as Voralazar had pressed Bellatrix. He pressed the throat directly. He pressed it in the place where in a wizard the channel of the magic ran from the chest into the breath. He held it there. He spoke. He said, "I will not take you. I will hold you until the Wraiths come." He held him. Lucius did not move. 3 of the wraiths peeled from their row and came to Kethrim's side. The wraiths were not silver in this moment. They were dark in the way water is dark when it has not yet been disturbed. They took Lucius from Kethrim's hand and they wrapped around him and they began, in the way the binding had specified, to draw him. They drew him toward the center of the atrium, where the marble had broken at the foot of the dark fountain. They drew him toward what was, beneath the marble, the same threshold Harry had stood at in the Veil Room. The marble at the foot of the fountain parted. It parted as the curtain at the threshold had parted. It opened to a depth. The depth was the threshold. The threshold was, at the bottom of it, the chorus. The wraiths drew Lucius into the depth. Lucius made a sound. The sound was not, by the standards of human sounds, a sound. The sound was the sound of a wizard being drawn past the threshold he had not been ready to cross. The marble closed. The atrium was by then in motion. The Death Eaters had broken. They had broken in the way fish break when the fisherman has thrown the net wider than the fish had anticipated. Travers had run for the lifts. Macnair had cast a series of curses at the wraiths nearest him, and had then attempted to apparate. He had not apparated. The wards Voldemort had loosened to let his force in had not, by an oversight Voldemort would later regret, been loosened in both directions. Outgoing apparition was still bound. Macnair had stood at the lift in a confusion that lasted approximately 4 seconds, after which a wraith, a young Norwegian sailor lost in a storm in 1690, had stepped through the marble wall behind him and put a hand on his shoulder. Macnair fell. Travers reached the lifts. The lifts did not open. The lifts had been instructed, by an arrangement Harry had made through the flue 3 weeks earlier with a portrait in the lift housing whose name no living wizard remembered, not to open at the atrium for the next 6 minutes. Travers turned. Travers cast. Travers met 3 of the wraiths in succession and could not hold them. Travers fell. Dolohov reached the half-broken fountain and tried, with 2 hands, to lift the marble basin from its plinth. He had read in his own training that goblin marble could be turned to a portal in emergencies. He had not read the conditions. The marble of the atrium fountain did not turn. Dolohov, with the marble in his hands, was found by Senithorix. Senithorix, who had been waiting on the dais of the dark fountain itself, in the form Senithorix had selected for the night, a tall, thin man with the beak of a nose and the robe of green silk, stepped down from the plinth. Senithorix did not put his hand on Dolohov. Senithorix spoke a single syllable in the form even older than the old form, the form the Hungarian magister had used in life. The syllable arrived at Dolohov's chest. Dolohov, who had been carrying the marble basin, set the basin down with the care of a man who has been told, in a language he understood without translation, that he had been counted out. He sat on the floor. He folded his hands. He waited. Senithorix turned away. 2 of the wraiths came forward and took Dolohov to the center and drew him into the parted marble at the foot of the fountain, and the marble closed, and Dolohov was gone. In the center of the atrium, Harry watched. He watched as a man watches a procedure he has designed and that is performing within the parameters he had set. He registered in himself the precise dispassion he had expected to feel. He registered, secondarily, the small lift in the reservoir that came as each of the bound completed an action of the kind the binding had been arranged for. The lifts were not pride. They were not gratification. They were the small physical pleasures a body has when it is operating at the design specification of an instrument. The atrium emptied of Death Eaters. The atrium emptied of the alive who had come to take the boy in the center. The atrium did not empty of the dead. The dead had been instructed to remain. The wraiths, 300 minus the ones the takings had consumed, perhaps 30 had been consumed, he would tally later, stood in their wide silver ring around him. The 3 liches stood in the inner ring. The threshold at the foot of the fountain had closed. The atrium was silent. In the silence, Voldemort came in. He did not come through the fireplace. He came through the visitor's entrance. He came on his own feet, which was the courtesy he extended to himself when his servants had failed. He came in his thinness, in his white skin, in his absence of features, in his red eyes that had been refined over the year since the graveyard into a precision they had not had then. He came across the marble. He saw on the marble the bodies of Rookwood and Bellatrix in the absence of Lucius and the absence of the rest of his force. He stopped. He looked at the ring of the wraiths. He looked at the 3 liches. He looked at the boy in the center. He looked last at the boy's face. Voldemort, in his careful reading of faces, saw what was in the boy's face. He saw what the boy had become. He saw what the boy had become because he, Voldemort, who had been more than 100 wizards in his time of study, had once in his youth in the library at Hogwarts in the year of the chamber, read a book, Caspar Mowbray's Lineages and Talents, 1602, and had read a chapter and had read an underlined word, and had thought at the time that no such waking would occur within his ambition. Voldemort had been wrong. Voldemort understood, in the seconds he stood in the atrium and looked at the boy he had come to kill, that he had been wrong, and that the waking had occurred, and that the waking had not been to him. He did not then raise his wand. He looked at Harry. He said in English, in the voice he used for negotiations he was about to lose, "Potter." Harry inclined his head, the precise courtesy he had given Rookwood. "Yes, how long?" 3 years, without your headmaster, without anyone. Voldemort's red eyes moved across the ring of the wraiths once more. He registered the liches. He registered in particular Voralazar, whom he had read about in his own youth and whose name he had not then known to redact. He said again in English, "You will in due course be told to put them down. Yes, you will not number. You understand that this places you in a category of wizard the world has not maintained an apparatus to manage. Yes, you understand that the world will in due course attempt to construct such an apparatus. Yes, you understand that the apparatus will fail. I am prepared for the attempt." Voldemort in the silence looked at him. He thought about engaging. The thought was visible on what he had for a face. The thought was visible also to the 3 liches, who had been wizards once and who understood the registration of strategic thought in another wizard's posture. They moved slightly in the inner ring. They moved in the way that signaled to him and signaled to Harry that they had calculated his odds against them and had found the odds unacceptable for his side. Voldemort registered the calculation. He did not engage. He said with the precise rage of a man whose pride was the only ornament he had retained through his years of mutilation, "I will not be put down by a child." Harry said with the level he had been refining for 3 years, "Not tonight." Voldemort turned. He walked back across the marble. He went out the visitor's entrance the way he had come. He apparated from the street outside, by privilege he retained that lesser wizards in his service did not, into a dark forest in Albania he had used as a refuge in his disembodied years. He arrived in the forest. He stood in the cold dark under the trees. He did not speak. He thought in the precise interior voice he had cultivated since his youth. "I will have to remake the war," he thought. "I cannot remake it from this country." He thought last with a coldness he had not employed in 20 years. "I will go further into the trees, and I will sit in the dark, and I will think about what I have just seen, until I can think about it without my hands shaking." He went further into the trees. He sat in the dark. The Albanian forest around him did not register the arrival of the wizard who had been in his time the foremost of his kind. The Albanian forest, as forests do, attended to its own business, and the small dead in the underbrush did not yet know him, and the wind in the trees, which had been blowing across that part of the country for 10,000 years, blew. In the atrium of the Ministry of Magic in London, Harry stood among his army. He breathed. He waited. In due course Dumbledore arrived. He arrived with 3 members of the Order. He arrived through the visitor's entrance. He arrived because, by Harry's earlier projection, Dumbledore had been monitoring the department's lower wards and had registered the breach at the moment Voldemort's apparition had cracked them. He arrived in his robes with his wand in his hand, and he stopped at the threshold of the atrium and looked at what was in the atrium. He looked for some time. He did not, in the looking, lower his wand. He looked finally at Harry. He said quietly in the voice that had carried him through 100 such rooms over a long life, "Harry." Harry inclined his head. "Sir, whose work is this?" "Mine." Dumbledore's wand did not lower. Dumbledore's face did not change. "I see," he said. He stood for some time. He did not then reproach. He did not then lecture. He did, in the silence that grew between them across the marble, what he was best in the world at doing, which was to revise in real time the model of a student he had been carrying for 15 years, in the direction the evidence required, and to begin already in the seconds his face did not change, the construction of the new strategy his teaching of that student would, from this minute, require. He looked at Voralazar. He looked at Kethrim. He looked last at Senithorix, whose form was still selected, and who inclined his beaked head a degree, in the courtesy of one old wizard to another. He looked at Harry again. He said in the same voice, "We will speak." Harry said with the same level, "Tomorrow." Dumbledore inclined his head. He turned. He walked back through the visitor's entrance. The Order, behind him, followed. In the atrium the lifts opened, and Hermione and Ron and Luna and Neville and Ginny stepped out of the central lift in the bewildered silence of 15-year-olds who had been held in a time-locked room for 3 subjective hours, and who had emerged into a marble hall full of silver figures and dark-robed liches and the bodies of Death Eaters on the floor. Hermione saw Harry in the center. She did not run, she walked. She walked across the marble in the slow, careful way of a person who has, in the last hour, learned a new fact about her oldest friend and is, in walking toward him, processing what the fact will require of her in the rest of her life. She stopped at the edge of the inner ring. She did not at first speak. She looked at the wraiths. She looked at the liches. She looked at Harry. She said in the level voice she used when she had finished asking and was now about to know, "Harry, Hermione, you did all this." "Yes, tonight, the wraiths tonight, the liches in February, the inferi in 4th year, and what you are for 3 years," she breathed. She looked at him for some time. She said finally, "All right." She did not say what the all right meant. He registered that she did not say. He registered that the meaning would unfold in the months ahead, and that the unfolding would be one of the central labors of his 16th and 17th years, and that he would meet it as he had met everything else with the discipline he had been refining since the pitch. Ron, behind her, said in a voice that was not entirely steady, "Bloody hell, Harry." Harry let briefly the smile his face had practiced for these occasions come up. He let it be small. He let it be tired. He let it be, in a way it had not been in 3 years, real. "Yeah," he said, "sorry about that." Above them in the structure of the atrium, the wraiths began, in the order he had set, to dissipate back to the wild places he had named for them. The liches stepped back into the marble of the floor. The threshold at the foot of the fountain stayed closed. The atrium grew quieter. It did not grow silent. It would not, after this night, ever be silent for him again. Before the children had been released from the time-locked room, before Dumbledore had been signaled, before the wraiths had been instructed to dissipate, the inferi had come up through the rotunda above. They had come up at the moment the binding had specified. They had come up not through the marble of the atrium itself, but through the floor of the central rotunda one level up, the floor of the public ministry that the atrium served, where the lifts opened onto the level the Daily Prophet's offices occupied during business hours, and that at this hour was empty. The matriarch led them. She had carried in her articulation the responsibility of the new contingent. She had been the spider who had been raised first in the autumn of 4th year. She had been the spider who had held the perimeter for 2.5 academic years. She had been the spider Harry had selected, by name and not by name, to speak his calling to the rest. She walked now in the rotunda above the atrium, at the head of 42 raised inferi, the original 27 of the Acromantula colony, the 12 who had arrived in the spring of 4th year, and 3 further who had come in the autumn of 5th year from a unicorn herd the centaurs had not been able to retrieve. They had come up the long path from the deep glade 3 weeks earlier. They had traveled by night by the channels Harry had set them. They had come through the flue at the Hog's Head at the precise hour the matriarch had been told. They had surfaced by the arrangement Harry had made with the obliging ghost in the Diagon Alley wall, in the rotunda above the ministry's atrium. They had waited. When the signal came, they had moved. They had been instructed to come down to the atrium only if reinforcements arrived for the Death Eaters. This was the precaution Harry had built in against the contingency that Voldemort would bring a second wave. Voldemort had not brought a second wave. The matriarch had registered the absence of reinforcement. She had held the rotunda. She had, at the end of the engagement, brought the inferi down the marble stair that led from the rotunda to the atrium, in the order Harry had specified for the inspection that he would on the night conduct. They came down the stair after Voldemort had left. They came down silently. The inferi did not have voices. They had postures. Their postures were the postures of a force that had been disciplined for a long time and that had not lost the discipline in the journey. The matriarch came first. Carapaces of the acromantulas followed her in the order they had risen in. The unicorn husks followed the spiders. The bones of the medieval poachers followed the unicorns. They stopped at the foot of the stair. They inclined what could be inclined. Hermione had not yet come down from the lift. The lifts were still descending the time-locked room's 3 subjective minutes. Harry had the atrium to himself with his army. He stood in the center. He looked at the matriarch. He said in the old form, "Well done." The matriarch inclined. He said, "You will return with these to the forest. You will hold the forest as you have held it. You will, at the next call, come further." The matriarch inclined again. He let them turn. They turned. They walked back up the marble stair to the rotunda. They went back through the flue at the Hog's Head. By dawn they would be back in the deep glade in the same arc they had held for 21 months with the matriarch at the head. The forest would not for the next 12 hours know they had gone. Then he let the wraiths begin to dissipate. The wraiths did not all dissipate at once. The Mycenaean woman left first. She inclined to him. She passed through the wall to the south. The legionary followed. The plague child went last, lingering for some seconds at the foot of the dais of the fountain, looking up at Harry with the resignation she had worn at the veil. He inclined to her. She inclined back. She passed through the marble. Within 4 minutes the 300 had gone. The liches remained. They remained because the liches were a different order of binding. The wraiths had been bound by the veil's threshold. Their place of rest was the wild places he had named for them. The liches had been bound by the vault's crystal. Their place of rest was the cave on the Scottish coast, and they would not return there until the engagement of the night had been fully concluded, which by their own measure included the conversation Harry would now have with the men and women he had deceived. They stood in the inner ring. They did not speak. They did not move. It was at this moment that the central lift opened and the children came out and the conversation with Hermione began. After Hermione and Ron had said what they had said, and after Luna had touched with her usual precision the place on the marble where Bellatrix had fallen, and after Ginny had not spoken at all but had only looked at Harry with the eyes of a girl who had been 12 in the chamber, and after Neville had said in his Neville voice that he supposed he had a great many questions and would ask them later, after all this, the visitor's entrance opened again and Sirius came in. Sirius had not come with Dumbledore. Sirius had come on his own. He had come from Grimmauld Place via apparition. He had broken the Order's house arrest. In the small confines of a black family loophole he had been preserving for the right occasion, and he had arrived at the Ministry on his own feet. He came through the door at a run. He stopped when he saw the atrium. He stopped in the way a man stops when he has been running for an hour toward a fight he had been certain he would arrive at and has arrived instead at the silence after. He stood in the doorway. He looked at the bodies on the marble. He looked at the broken patch of marble at the foot of the fountain. He looked at the 3 liches in their inner ring. He looked at Harry. He did not at first walk forward. He stood in the doorway with his wand in his hand and his hair wet from the rain on the street outside. He said in the voice he had used in his letters, "Harry, Sirius." Sirius did not then ask any of the questions a man might have asked. He walked across the marble. He walked between the bodies. He walked past the broken patch at the foot of the fountain. He came to the inner ring. The liches inclined to him. He did not return the inclination because he had not in his life learned how to. He came past the liches. He came to where Harry was. He stopped 2 paces from Harry. He said very quietly, "Are you all right?" Harry, who had been ready for almost every question, was not ready for that one. He stood for a beat. He said, "Yes." Sirius nodded. Sirius reached out and put his hand on Harry's shoulder in the place his hand had been on the platform at King's Cross. He did not press. He did not lecture. He did not demand an account. He held his hand on his godson's shoulder for the length of a breath, and then he took it away, and then he said, "I think we should sit down." Harry inclined his head. There was nowhere to sit. The atrium was a marble hall. The fountain at its center was broken. The benches along the walls were not built for occupancy. He went instead with Sirius and Ron and Hermione and Luna and Neville and Ginny to the small side room off the visitor's entrance that the Ministry used for waiting petitioners. The room had chairs. The room had a table. The room had a kettle that in normal hours the night clerk used to make tea. They sat. Harry sat at the head of the table because in the new order of things this was the place he had been put. He did not refuse it. He did not, in any visible way, accept it. He sat in the chair that was at the head. Sirius sat at his right. Hermione sat at his left. The others took the chairs along the table. Ron put the kettle on because Ron was Ron, and because at moments of this kind the things one had been taught as a child by one's mother were what one reached for. The kettle boiled. Tea was made. Harry did not at the table give an account. He gave instead 3 sentences. He said, "I have been studying for 3 years what I am. I will not put down what I have raised. I will use them now against Voldemort." Sirius inclined his head. Hermione, after a moment, said, "All right." Ron said, Are we still your friends?" Harry looked at Ron. He felt, in the seat at the head of the table, the small lift the reservoir had given him each time a binding had completed. He recognized in the lift a fact about Ron's question that the reservoir had recognized before he had. The fact was that Ron had asked the question that would, in fact, determine the rest of it. The fact was that the answer to Ron's question was the answer to the whole. He said, with the level he had been refining since the hospital wing, "Yes." Ron breathed out. Ron nodded. Ron drank his tea. Hermione, on the other side, looked at Harry for a long beat. She did not then say anything more. She had been the one in the entrance hall in June of 4th year. She had been the one to ask in March of 5th year, and to be deflected. She had been the one to walk across the marble of the atrium and to know. She did not, in the chair at the table, ask another question. She drank her tea. Luna said, "Are the Department of Mysteries vault residents going back, or are they staying?" Harry looked at her. He said, "Staying." Luna nodded. She drank her tea. Neville said, with the slight cough that always preceded his more serious questions, Will it make the world worse, what you've done?" Harry considered the question with the gravity it had been asked with. He said, "Voldemort will be put down. The world will be worse for what was already true in it. It will not be worse for what I have added. I will not let it be." Neville inclined his head in the manner he had been practicing since the start of the DA, which was the manner of a young man who had been told at 13 that he had a long way to go and that he had now begun to go it. Ginny did not speak. She watched Harry, she watched the others, she watched for one beat Sirius. Then she went back to watching Harry. When the tea was finished, Sirius stood. He said, "I will speak to Dumbledore." Harry nodded. "He will wish a conversation, Harry. He will wish it as soon as he can have it. He will be slow after tonight in pressing the conversation, but he will, in the next 48 hours, ask it of you. You will be ready." "I am ready." "Yes," Sirius said. He looked at Harry for a moment longer. He said, "Your mother's brother, your great-uncle Charles, who was a black on the wrong side, did in 1958 attempt a small fraction of what you have done. He did not have the talent, he had only the appetite. He failed. He died in the failure. Your mother told me of him on a night in 1979 when we were drunk and young. I have wondered since I read your letter in February whether you knew. I did not, sir. You should now. Yes, he will not be the warning you take, he will be the data point you have. Yes." Sirius inclined his head. He turned and went out. Harry sat at the head of the table. Ron, Hermione, Luna, Neville, Ginny. They sat for some time longer in the small side room off the visitors' entrance. They did not speak. They had said what they had to say. They drank in the silence the remainder of the tea. Then they went up. They went up the marble stair to the rotunda. They went down the corridors. They went out the visitors' entrance into the rain on the street. The ministry around them was, by some agreement they did not yet understand, still empty. The order had not arrived in force. The Aurors had not arrived. The night clerk had not come back from his break. The street outside was the street outside. Sirius was waiting on the pavement. He had not gone, in fact, to Dumbledore. He had gone, instead, only as far as the corner in case his godson needed him on the way out. He saw them come. He came up to them. He walked with them down the street in the rain in his Auror's stride that he had not used in 15 years, with his hand near his wand and his eyes on every shadow and his godson at his shoulder. They reached the apparition point. Sirius took Harry's arm. They apparated. They apparated not to Grimmauld Place. They apparated by an arrangement Sirius had made before he had left the house, to a small wood north of London where in 1971 Sirius and James had once camped without permission for a weekend, and where the protective wards set then by James in a moment of teenage competence still held to this hour. They arrived in the wood. The wood was wet, the trees were tall, the air smelled of summer. Sirius let go of his arm. Sirius did not then ask anything further. He stood with him in the wood, in the rain, in the dark, with the wards humming around them at a frequency only a black would recognize. He stood with him for as long as Harry needed to be stood with. Eventually Harry said, "Thank you." Sirius said, "Always." Sirius apparated them to a place near Hogsmeade, from which they walked the rest of the way to Hogwarts in the rain, and Harry went up the long path to the castle alone, and Sirius, who had been ordered not to be seen in this part of the country, apparated back to Grimmauld Place to begin the conversation with Dumbledore he had said he would. Harry walked. He walked through the rain. He walked through the wet grass. He walked through the front door. He walked up to the hospital wing, because at this hour Madame Pomfrey would be the only adult awake who would ask him no questions he was not prepared to answer. Pomfrey was awake. Pomfrey looked at him in the way she had looked at him in third year. Pomfrey did not ask. She put him in a bed. She gave him a glass of water. She drew the curtains. She said, "Sleep, Mr. Potter." Yes, he slept. When he woke, it was morning. The hospital wing was full of gray light. The dead in the corridors were going about their business. The castle was, by the sounds beyond the door, in the ordinary motion of an ordinary morning, except that he could hear, in the corridor, the steps of Albus Dumbledore approaching. He sat up. He waited. The door opened. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. The Dark Lord who was never Tom Riddle. The conversation with Dumbledore lasted 41 minutes. It was not the conversation either had imagined. Dumbledore came in with the patience of a man who had been revising his model through the night and who had arrived, by the hour of the hospital wing, at the version he could now act on. He sat in the chair Hermione had used in third year. He put his hands together in his lap. He looked at Harry over his half-moon spectacles. He did not at first speak. He looked. He looked in the way he had not let himself look in 2.5 years, with the attention of a man finally permitting himself to read the page he had been holding closed. He read what was in front of him. He read with the precision 100 years of teaching had refined in him, the necromancer that the boy had become. He read the shape of the new instrument. He read the reservoir which was, at the rest after the night, banked to a thin, steady line. He read without using legilimency. There would be no legilimency between them again, the calibration of the face that had been refining itself in mirrors since the spring of third year. He read it all in approximately 7 seconds. He breathed. He said, Harry, sir, I should like to ask first whether you are well. I am tired. Yes. I will sleep again after. Yes. He waited a beat. Second, Dumbledore said, I should like to apologize. Harry inclined his head, the precise courtesy he had given Sirius. For what, sir? For not seeing it sooner, for not asking sooner, for having allowed by my own forbearance a circumstance in which a 13-year-old undertook this work without an adult to consult. You could not have helped me, sir. Dumbledore's eyes held his. I could not. That is the apology. Harry said nothing. Dumbledore continued. Third, I have in the last 6 hours reorganized my plans. The Horcruxes that I had intended to address over the course of the next 2 years, I will address in a different way. I will provide you with the information I have about them. I will provide it to you in writing tonight. I will not ask you to share with me the methods by which you will undertake their destruction. I will undertake to support, with the resources of the Order, any operational requirement that you specify. I will not in this support attempt to manage you. I have understood over the night that the management you require is no longer of a kind I am qualified to supply. Sir, you will in time take from this castle whatever role of authority the wizarding world is prepared to grant you. I expect this. I do not protest it. I will in the interim hold the headmastership for as long as it is useful for me to hold it. I will hold it specifically as cover for the operations you and I will now jointly undertake against Tom. Yes, sir. Fourth and last, you will, when this is over, find yourself in a position you have not yet considered. You will be sovereign in a sense the wizarding world has not had since the 11th century, over an army that does not answer to it. The army will be yours. The army will be useful. The world will fear the army. The world will, in time, decide what to do with the army's commander. You will be that commander. I will not, in the time I have left, be able to instruct you on this question. You will instruct yourself. I have been preparing, sir. Yes, he paused. I had thought, Dumbledore said, that I would have a longer time to teach you what I knew. I had thought that as well, sir. You have done the work without me. Yes, sir, that is well. He stood. He went to the door. At the door he paused. Harry, sir. There is one matter on which I will, before we close this conversation, ask a personal favor. Yes, when Tom is dead, will you visit me? Harry looked at him. He understood the favor. He understood, in the way he had been understanding such things for 3 years, what the favor cost the man asking it. Yes, sir. Dumbledore inclined his head. He went out. Harry sat in the white bed and let the conversation be what it had been. He filed it under. The most useful adult I have spoken to in 3 years has now told me he will work for me. The arrangement is acceptable. He slept again. The next year did not, as he had thought it might, take the shape of a continued school career. It took the shape of a campaign. The campaign was not announced. The campaign was not publicly described. The campaign was conducted from the outside in the form of a series of disappearances, of accidents, of strange weather over certain houses on certain coasts, of small fires in certain libraries, of foreign students arriving at Hogwarts in late August who were, by the inspection of the Daily Prophet, not students at all. Harry remained on the public record at Hogwarts. He attended his 6th-year lessons. He took Newt-level potions, Newt-level charms, Newt-level transfiguration, Newt-level defense, Newt-level arithmancy. He did the work. He scored outstandings in 3 subjects and exceeds expectations in 2. He played in the autumn 2 games of Quidditch with the Gryffindor team that Wood had not been able to attend because Wood had graduated. He was a competent seeker. He caught the snitch in the first game and lost it in the second. The results did not engage him. In the gaps between lessons and the gaps between Quidditch and the gaps after curfew, he conducted his hunt. He conducted it with the army. He conducted it with the army through the channels he had built in the spring. He went by the Dreamlink in cautious applications no more frequent than once a fortnight to wherever the next of the 7 was. He went in the body on 3 occasions. He traveled in the body only after Hermione and Ron had been permitted in October to know everything he had not been able to tell them in the spring, and after they had, in their separate ways, made their separate adjustments, and after they had insisted on accompanying him to the body trips. He let them because they had earned it. Hermione in October, after a long Saturday conversation in the room of requirement at which Dumbledore had also been present, had said, "We will help you with the Horcruxes. We will not help you with what you do with the army. The 2 are different. The first is what we are for. The second is yours." He had agreed. He had agreed because the distinction was, in fact, the correct distinction. The Horcruxes had been the work of a wizard who had cut his soul into 7 and had distributed the cuts across the world. The work of finding the cuts and destroying them was the work of any wizard's friends. Harry had the friends he had. He let them work. He found the cuts by the death sight he had had since the graveyard. He had refined the sight over the year and a half since the cauldron. He had refined it to a precision that allowed him to perceive, at a distance of 100 miles, the residue of a soul cut in any object that had been bound to one. The residue was to his eyes a steady silver thread that ran from the object outward in the direction of the parent soul. The thread was visible to him at all times. It was visible to no one else. He told Hermione and Ron where each thread led. They went. The locket was in the cave at the Inferi pool. They went with Dumbledore. Dumbledore had insisted on this one, and they retrieved it. The Inferi in the pool registered on Harry's entry his binding, and they did not, as the literature would have predicted, attack. They withdrew to the deep water. Dumbledore noted the withdrawal. He filed it. He asked no question. The diadem was at Hogwarts, in the room of requirement, in a heap of forgotten objects in the room's hidden version. Hermione found it on a Tuesday afternoon. She brought it down to Harry in the tower in a velvet bag. She had not touched it. She had used her wand to lift it and her wand to bag it. She had read, before approaching it, 3 books on the protective wards a Horcrux might bear. He destroyed it in the tower fireplace with fiendfire that he summoned and controlled by the talent, a technique not in the textbooks, but which the residue behind its seal had whispered to him over the autumn, and which he had verified independently against the Caucasian texts Vorlazar had in dream transmitted to him. The cup was in Bellatrix's vault at Gringotts. After Bellatrix's death in the atrium, the vault had been frozen by the goblins' pending probate. The cup was thus, by the bureaucratic accident of magical inheritance law, unguarded by any living person. The goblins permitted Harry's representative, Sirius, who was Bellatrix's nearest male relative, had legal standing to enter the vault. Sirius took the cup. He brought it to Harry. Harry destroyed it. The diary had been destroyed in second year by Harry himself before he had known what he was destroying. The ring was in the Gaunt Shack. Harry went, with Ron and Hermione in late November, to the Gaunt Shack at midnight. The shack was in a hollow in Little Hangleton. The wards on the ring were as Dumbledore had warned, layered, antique, designed to destroy the wizard who attempted to lift the ring without the proper protocol. The protocol was, by Dumbledore's analysis, irrecoverable. Harry recovered it. He recovered it because the wards had been laid by Tom Riddle at the age of 17, and the residue behind the seal in Harry's mind had been Tom Riddle at the age of 16, and the residue had drilled the 17-year-old's protocols into the 16-year-old who would, 1 year later, lay them. The residue remembered the protocols. The residue in October had, at Harry's invitation through the seal, written them out on a piece of parchment in Harry's hand. Harry knew the protocols. He performed them. He lifted the ring. The ring contained, by its arrangement, the resurrection stone, the second of the Hallows. Harry registered the stone. He pocketed it. He destroyed the soul fragment in the ring with fiendfire. The serpent Nagini was at Voldemort's side in Albania. She would have to be addressed last, by force. Harry knew this from Dumbledore's analysis and from his own death sight. He let her be for now. That left, of the 7 cuts, 1 in himself, 1 in the serpent, and 1 in Voldemort. He addressed the 1 in himself in March. He addressed it not by dying, as the literature had suggested he might need to do. He addressed it by extending the discipline he had used in February of the previous year on the small room behind the seal in his mind. He brought the residue by the slow application of the talent over weeks into a position from which he could speak to it directly. The residue accepted the position. They spoke at length. The residue said in the end, "I do not wish to remain." Harry said in the form, "I will let you go." The residue said, "I am not by now anything Tom would acknowledge. I am the residue of his 16th year. I have been with you longer than I was with him. I have learned what you have learned. I am yours." Harry said, "Yes." The residue said, "Send me to the chorus when you do. Do not send me to him." Harry inclined his head. He sent the residue by the channel to the threshold of the veil. The chorus accepted it. The fragment passed by its own consent into the polyphony that had been waiting for it since 1943. Harry was, after the sending, lighter in the chest by a measure he had not known he had been carrying. He noted the lightness. He filed it under "cleanly done." Before the hunt began, he visited Helena. He had not seen her since the previous June, in the corridor at the foot of her tower, in the hour after the wraiths had been brought across. She had inclined her head as he passed. They had not spoken. The conversation had been postponed. He went up the stair under the cloak on a night in late March of his 6th year. He came to her room at the top. She was at the window. The window looked east over the lake. The lake that night was the color of beaten lead. There was no moon. She did not turn. She said, "You have closed the 6th lock." He said, "Yes, Helena, the residue is gone. It is well. You will be cleaner for the work that remains." "Yes." She turned. Her eyes had not warmed. Her hair was the same pewter. She walked in her unhurried way from the window to the center of the room. She stopped 2 paces from him. She said, "You will go to Albania in June." Yes, you will go alone into the clearing. Yes, you will need a closing of the binding that the literature has not written. I have drafted one. She watched him, she said, recite it. He recited it. He recited the 8 syllables he had drafted in February that he had refined since that he intended to speak when Voldemort's reverse calling arrived. She listened. When he was done, she said after a beat, the 3rd syllable is wrong. He waited. The 3rd syllable, she said, is from the wrong dialect. You have drawn it from Mowbray's reconstruction. Mowbray reconstructed it from a manuscript he did not finish reading. The syllable he gave was the syllable of the Mercian form of the line. The line of the eldest brother was not Mercian. The line was West Saxon. The syllable is one vowel different. The vowel matters. She gave him the correct vowel. He repeated the closing with the correction. She inclined. She said, now it is right. He inclined. She said, there is one further thing. You will not, before the closing, attempt to engage Voldemort by speech. You will let him speak. You will let him cast first. You will speak only the closing, only at the moment the reverse calling arrives. To speak earlier is to give him the cadence of your breath, which his year of observation has refined his ear for, and which you will need in that breath for the closing. He inclined. She said, last. He waited. She said, you will not, after Voldemort is dead, return to this castle in the manner you have come into it for 7 years. You will come back as a guest. The dead in the corridors will receive you as a guest of higher rank than the headmaster. You will not in the receipt declare anything. You will let the receipt be the declaration. He inclined. She said, now go. He went. He walked down the spiral of the Ravenclaw stair under the cloak. He came out into the corridor below. He let the breath be the breath he had practiced in the room. He filed Helena's corrections in the part of his memory that did not forget. He walked to the tower. He slept. He woke before dawn. He went in the small hours to the deep glade. He spoke the corrected closing to the matriarch in the 42. He spoke it 3 times. He noted that the 3rd vowel did the work the 2nd had failed to. He returned to the school by breakfast. He went to lessons. He went hunting Voldemort. The hunt was, in the public record, never described. In the private record, kept in shorthand in a small book Harry carried in the inside pocket of his cloak, the hunt occupied the spring of his 6th year and the entire of his 7th, with a single interval in August when he took 2 weeks at the Weasleys for Bill and Fleur's wedding. He went in the hunt to 7 countries. He went by apparition to Albania first, by apparition to Romania second, by long-distance flew to Bulgaria, by international portkey to Russia by ship, for a reason connected to a binding he had laid on a kraken, to Norway by a method that did not survive in the textbooks, to Iceland, and finally by his own feet on a path his cloak rendered invisible, back to Albania. He took the army with him on each trip. The army was, by the time of the hunt, larger than it had been in the atrium. It had grown by the addition of further inferi from the European forests, of further wraiths from a series of veils that had been built, he had discovered in his reading, at various smaller European departments of mysteries, and of 2 further liches whom Kethrim had identified by the channels in a sealed catacomb in the Carpathians. The lich count was now 5. The wraith count was approximately 700. The inferi count was approximately 3,000 by virtue of the European forests' long memory. Harry did not, on any of the trips, deploy more than he required. He deployed sparingly. He used the inferi for cordon. He used the wraiths for the taking of the Death Eaters they encountered. He used the liches only for the destruction of certain wards he could not penetrate alone. He met Voldemort in person 3 times before the final. The first was in Romania in the autumn of 6th year, in a high pass in the Carpathians, where Voldemort had attempted to recruit a vampire coven who, by their own report afterward, had been instructed by Senathorix in advance and had been waiting for the recruitment in order to refuse it. Voldemort had apparated out of the pass on perceiving Harry's army on the ridge above him. The second was in Russia, in midwinter of 6th year, in a frozen monastery in the Altai. Voldemort had been attempting to bind a Frostwraith to himself. The Frostwraith, who had heard the rumor of Harry through the channels, had refused. Voldemort had threatened. The Frostwraith had not yielded. Harry had arrived with the army at the moment the threat was being elaborated. He had not engaged. He had let Voldemort flee. He had subsequently bound the Frostwraith to himself by the same 40-syllable calling he had used at the Vale. The third was in Iceland in the spring of 7th year, in a blacksand cove on the southern coast. Voldemort had been attempting to recover, by an apparatus he had invented in his disembodied years, a soul cut he believed he could create from himself without the use of a Horcrux. The apparatus was novel. The apparatus did not work. Voldemort had stood in the black sand for a long minute and had registered the failure. Harry had arrived with the army at the end of the long minute. He had said in English, "There is no further cut." Voldemort had looked at him. Voldemort had said, "I will in due course find a method." Harry had said, "You will not have the time." Voldemort had apparated. The final meeting was in Albania, in late June of Harry's 7th year, in the forest where Voldemort had hidden in his disembodied years, and to which he had returned after Iceland in the recognition that the disembodied years forest was the only forest left to him. Harry went there alone. He went there alone because the final meeting was the meeting that, by the structure of the binding, the army could not be at. The army could be in the perimeter of the forest. The army could be in the trees. The army could not be in the clearing where the meeting would occur. The clearing would be theirs alone. He went on his own feet. He came to the clearing at dusk. The forest was Albanian summer. The trees were tall, the light was green, the air was warm. There were at the clearing's edge a series of wards Voldemort had laid in his refuge year. The wards were intact. Harry passed through them by the protocol the residue had given him, which the residue's own author had laid here in 1979 and which had not been altered since. He entered the clearing. Voldemort was there. He was thin. He was, by the end of the year of being hunted, thinner than he had been in the atrium. His features had not improved. His red eyes had, in their 7 months of nights without sleep, refined to a precision Harry had only seen in Helena's eyes on the Ravenclaw stair. Nagini was at his side. Harry registered Nagini. He registered with the death sight the silver thread of the soul cut inside her. He registered with the same sight the cuts in the wizard standing 2 yards from her. He registered 2 left. Voldemort said in English, "Potter." Harry said, "Tom." Voldemort registered the name. Voldemort said, "You will not call me that." Harry said, "I will. I will call you Tom because that is what you were and what you are again by the steady evacuation of your operation across this year. There is no lord here. There is a wizard called Tom Riddle. He is in front of me. He will be put down." Voldemort raised his wand. He did not then speak. He cast a curse Harry had not anticipated. The curse was not the killing curse. The curse was an inversion of the death magic Harry had been refining. Voldemort had, in his year of hunted study, located a paragraph in a book Harry had not found, Mowbray's last manuscript, written in his final illness, never published, in which Mowbray had described the only documented counter-operation against a wizard of the talent. The counter-operation was the casting of a reverse calling, a syllabic sequence that, instead of binding the dead to the wizard, attempted to bind the wizard to the dead. Voldemort cast it. He cast it correctly. He cast it with the breath in the place below the belly. He cast it with the cadence the talent required. He had taught himself the breath and the cadence in the hunted year by long observation of Harry through the channel of the residue, which had been until March still in Harry's mind and through which Voldemort had, by a forensic discipline of his own, learned what he could. The reverse calling left Voldemort's wand in the form the literature had predicted, a long, thin tongue of gray. It arrived at Harry's chest. It folded. It folded because Harry in the same second had spoken in the form, with the breath, in the cadence, the closing of his own binding. The closing of the binding was the operation by which the wizard of the talent, having heard a reverse calling, declared himself the line. The closing was not in any textbook. The closing was a thing Harry had drafted himself in the 3 months between Iceland and Albania on the basis of a fragment of the Baron's October song he had been refining for months. He had memorized it the previous week. He had practiced it on the matriarch in the deep glade 3 nights ago. He spoke it. He spoke it in 8 syllables. He spoke it as Voldemort's reverse calling arrived. The reverse calling folded. Voldemort's gray tongue of light did not strike. It rolled back along itself. It rolled by the principle the talent's literature had established and that Voldemort had not had time to anticipate toward its caster. It struck Voldemort. It struck him in the chest, in the place below the belly where the breath had been. Voldemort's reservoir, which he had been constructing through the year by the imitation of Harry's, was by the strike drained. He fell to one knee. Nagini moved. Senethorix stepped out of the trees at the edge of the clearing. Senethorix had been waiting there for 2 hours. Senethorix took Nagini. He took her by speaking, in the older form, the syllable he had spoken to Dolohav in the atrium. He spoke it with the precision of a wizard who had been Hungarian magister for 2 centuries, and who, at the height of his practice, had been the foremost binder of snakes in the Carpathian range. Nagini, who had been a snake before she had been a Horcrux, registered the syllable. She inclined her head as far as a snake could incline. She came to Senethorix's hand. She wound around his arm. She stilled. She had been bound. The soul cut in her had been, by the binding, freed. Harry, with the death sight, watched the silver thread thin and snap. The fragment of Tom Riddle that had been in Nagini went up, by the channels, to the threshold of the veil. The chorus accepted it. 6. Voldemort, on his knee in the clearing, watched. He watched in the way a man watches an apparatus he had been certain of and that had, in the operation he had set for it, been turned against him. He looked at Harry. he said in the voice he had used for negotiations he could now no longer enter into. I will not. He did not finish the sentence. Harry walked across the clearing. He stopped in front of Voldemort. He looked down at him. He said in English, "You will." He spoke the calling. He spoke the 7-syllable form of the calling that the line of the eldest brother had used in the 11th century for the dispatch of a wizard who had, in his lifetime, used the talent against the line. The 7-syllable form was the last sequence the residue in March before its release had given him. The form had not been used in 900 years. The form, when spoken, did not raise. The form did not bind. The form addressed the wizard's own soul in its remaining fragment and asked it the question every soul, sooner or later, had to answer. Are you finished here? Voldemort's soul in the remaining fragment answered. The answer was yes. Voldemort's body, which had not been a body in the strict sense for 15 years, fell forward into the grass. The 7th soul fragment, the central one, the one that had been Tom Riddle entire, rose out of the body. It rose for a moment. It hovered. It was in the death sight the color of an old burn. It went by the channel to the threshold of the veil. The chorus, who had been waiting for it since 1943, accepted it. 7. Harry stood in the clearing. He breathed. He breathed below the belly. He let the reservoir, which had been at the highest pitch it had ever reached, return to its quiet level. He looked at Senithorix. He inclined his head. Senithorix inclined his head. Senithorix moved, with Nagini wound on his arm, back into the trees. The wraiths in the perimeter dissipated. The Inferi in the perimeter withdrew by the channels to the wild places he had named for them in the year of the hunt. The clearing was empty of the army. The clearing was empty of the wizard who had been Voldemort. The clearing was Harry and the body in the grass and the green light of the Albanian summer dusk. He sat down in the grass. He sat for some time. He let himself, for the first time since the hospital wing in 3rd year, feel the whole of the feeling he had been carrying. The feeling was not triumph. The feeling was not grief. The feeling was the feeling of a man who had been doing one work for 4 years and had now finished it, and who was sitting in the small interval before the next work began. He let the interval be what it was. He did not then weep. He did not then exult. He sat. When the Albanian dusk had become Albanian night, he stood up. He looked at the body. He spoke in the form, the small instruction the literature recommended for the disposal of a wizard who had been put down by death magic. The body sank into the earth of the clearing. The earth closed over it. The clearing was, in the dim moonlight, an ordinary clearing. He walked out of the forest. He walked to the edge of the trees. He apparated to Hogsmeade. He walked the long path up to Hogwarts. He went in the silence before dawn up to the headmaster's tower, and the gargoyle opened for him without his speaking, and he went up the spiral stair, and he met in the office at the top the headmaster who had, by an arrangement he had set 7 months earlier, been waiting up for him. Dumbledore looked at him. Dumbledore said, "It is done." "Yes, sir." Dumbledore inclined his head. "You should sleep." "Yes, sir." Dumbledore stood. He came round the desk. He held out his hand. Harry took it. They shook hands. It was the first time. It was the only time. Dumbledore held the handshake for the beat the gesture required, and no longer. He said, "Go to bed, Harry." Harry went. In the months that followed, the wizarding world arranged itself around what had occurred. It arranged itself slowly. It arranged itself in the manner of a society that had not been required, in the lifetime of any of its current members, to arrange itself around a fact of this magnitude. It arranged itself in a series of small declarations, and a series of small concessions, and a series of small refusals to declare. The ministry, under a new minister selected for the function, declared Voldemort officially dead. The Wisengamot, after some debate, declared an amnesty for the surviving Death Eaters who consented to magical oath. The Daily Prophet, after a longer debate, declared Harry Potter the boy who had ended the war. It did not in either body declare what he was. The bodies did not have yet a vocabulary to declare it. He let them not declare. He went in the summer to a small house in the country that the goblins, in a gesture they had not been required to make, deeded to him from a vault of Bellatrix Lestrange's that had no remaining heirs. The house had 4 rooms. He lived in 2 of them. He let the other 2 be the rooms in which his army, in the precise sense that the army inhabited rooms, kept its meetings. The army met 3 times a year. It met in the spring, the summer, and the late autumn. The Lich Kethrim presided. Voralazar and Senithorix sat to his left and right. The 2 further liches from the Carpathians, whose names were less easily pronounced and who had not yet been introduced to the public record, sat further along. The Wraith delegates there were, by the spring after the war, 14 Wraith delegates representing the various wild places, sat in a row across the table. The matriarch of the Deep Glade, who had been called up by the new channels Harry had built, sat at the head of a separate small table near the door. Harry sat at the center of the table. He did not preside, he listened, he gave instructions. The instructions were, by the third meeting, more often confirmations of the Bound's own proposals than initiations of his own. The army had, by the year after the war, organized its own affairs in the manner of a senate that had been bound, voluntarily, to a sovereign whom it consulted out of respect rather than necessity. The world around the house went on. In the world, in the year after the war, the wizarding population reconstituted itself. The order disbanded, the Aurors retrained. The Daily Prophet, under new management, ran a series on the lessons of the war. The ministry, after a long debate, established a new department, the Department of Boundaries, whose function was the documentation of the structures Harry had built and the maintenance of the wards by which those structures were now kept clear of the living. Harry served, by appointment, as the department's first advisor. He did not serve as its head. He served as its advisor, in the sense that a sovereign serves as the advisor of a council he does not require, but whose work he respects. In the autumn after the war, Snape resigned the post he had been holding at Hogwarts for 16 years. He resigned by a letter to Dumbledore, written in the precise hand he had used for student reports for the same 16 years. The letter contained one operative sentence: "I have done what I undertook to do." He visited Harry once before he left the country. The visit was at the house in the country in the early evening, by appointment Harry had not solicited, and to which Harry had none the less consented. Snape stood in the hall. He did not at first speak. He looked at the house, at the 4 rooms, at the field beyond, at the matriarch in the field who, by the seasonal arrangement, was visiting from the forest for the conversation Snape had asked to have. He said, "Potter, sir, I will not say what I came to say in front of the matriarch." Harry inclined his head. The matriarch in the field inclined what she could incline. She walked, in the unhurried way she had walked for 43 years, to the further hedge. She would not, by her own discipline, listen. Snape and Harry walked to the smaller of the 2 rooms Harry used as living quarters. They sat. They did not drink anything. Snape said, "I have been, in the years since the hospital wing corridor in your 3rd year, watching you become what you have become. Yes, sir, I have not betrayed you to either side. I know, sir, I have not in my own house told what I have read of you to anyone. I know, sir." Snape watched him. "I will not stay in this country," he said. "I have in the next decade no role I am prepared to perform here. I have purchased a small house in Provence. I will keep bees. I will write a monograph on potions theory that I have been postponing for 20 years. I will not return. Yes, sir, I have, before going, one statement to make to you. It is not strictly owed. It is a courtesy, sir. I knew your mother. Yes, sir, I loved your mother." Harry watched him. "I will say this once in this room and never again, and I will say it not to you specifically, but to the wizard who carries her line. She would have done what you have done. She would have done it in a different style. She would have not, perhaps, raised an army. She would have, with the line, found a use of it that suited her temperament. The line in her was a line that, had it surfaced, would have surfaced in service. The line in you has surfaced in sovereignty. The difference is not in the line. The difference is in the wizard who carries it. I do not, in this judgment, prefer one to the other. Yes, sir, she would, I think, have been proud. Thank you, sir." Snape inclined his head in the smallest courtesy he had given any student in 20 years. He stood, he went out, he apparated from the front step. Harry did not see him again. The matriarch came back from the hedge. She inclined to Harry. They stood for some time in the field. Then Harry returned to the house, and the matriarch returned to the forest by the channels, and the autumn afternoon settled into evening, and the field went, at sunset, into its blue dusk. Hermione married Ron in the autumn after the war. The wedding was a small one. Harry attended. He stood at the back of the room. He spoke when called on, the words a friend speaks at such occasions. He left before the dancing. He had not in the year recovered the capacity for dancing. He was not certain he would. He noted the absence. He filed it. Sirius lived another 19 years. He served as a kind of unofficial second in command of the house in the country. He died of a heart attack on a Tuesday afternoon in 2017 in the garden, holding a cup of tea. Harry buried him in the field behind the house. He raised, by his own choice and against the urging of the council, a small marker on the field that did not name what was beneath it. The field, by his arrangement, would not be disturbed by any living wizard while the marker stood. Dumbledore lived 3 years after the war. He died in his sleep in the spring of Harry's 3rd post-war year. Harry, who had visited him as he had agreed in the hospital wing, attended the funeral. He stood in the front row. He shook hands with the mourners. He gave, when asked, the small eulogy a former student gives. He left before the burial. He had been told by Helena on the Ravenclaw stair the previous winter that Dumbledore had requested no formal mourning. The request had been honored. The dead in the corridors of Hogwarts kept their station. The dead in the wild places kept theirs. The dead in the room behind the door inside Harry's skull, that long room with no lamp in which something had lifted its head at the impact in third year, sat with him, in the way the dead sat with their sovereign for the rest of his life. He did not, in any year of that life, lose the calibration. He was, in the wizarding world after the war, the new Dark Lord. He was not the Dark Lord Tom Riddle had been. He was not the Dark Lord any Dark Lord before him had been. He was not the Dark Lord by ambition. He had not, at any point in his life, wished to be a Dark Lord. He had only, by the structure of what he was and the structure of what the wizarding world had not built any apparatus to accommodate, arrived at the title. He held the title with the precision he had brought to everything else. He held it without theater. He held it without speeches. He held it in the quiet of the house in the country, in the room he met the army in the corridors he walked at Hogwarts when he visited Helena, in the dungeon when he visited the Baron, in the small marker in the field where Sirius lay. The world bent around him. The world bent around him without his pressing on it. The world bent around him in the way the world bends around any sovereignty whose authority is grounded in a structure older than the world's institutions, that the world cannot dispute and cannot extract and cannot place, and that the world in time learned to take as a given of the landscape, like a mountain a country had not previously had to incorporate into its maps, and that now appeared on every map afterward in the same color, by the same convention, with the same brief annotation. The Lord of the Dead, he lived a long life. He had no children. He had no successor. He did not require one. The line of the eldest brother had been, for 1,000 years, a line of one wizard at a time. It had skipped in its dormancy hundreds of bloodlines and had surfaced. When it surfaced, in the one wizard the line required, it would surface, if it surfaced again, in whomever it required at the time of its next waking. He did not select the next. He could not have. The line was not selected. He died in his bed on a Sunday morning in the late spring of a year he did not name in his will. The army did not mourn him. The army absorbed him. The army accepted, by the channels he had built, the fragment of his own soul that joined them, for he had not, at the close, gone to the chorus. He had gone, by his own choice and by the arrangement his binding permitted, to the room he had built in the house in the country. He sat in the chair he had sat in for 40 years. The room was for the new visitors. The chair was empty. The figure that had occupied it was, by the new sight, present. The army went on. The wizarding world went on. The mountain on the map stayed where it was. In the deep glade in the forbidden forest, the matriarch, bound to him for 43 years, held the perimeter for the next sovereign of the line, who was not yet awake, who had not yet been called, who would, when the cold came up into his arms from the inside and the door behind the long room opened, find the army that had been waiting for him in the quietness it had been keeping since the death of the wizard who had been there first since. He had been the first. He had been the first in 1,000 years. He had not, in the keeping of his title, lost the discipline that had made it. The shape had been cold. The shape had been certain. The shape did not, anywhere in it, contain a flinch. Chapter 7 End.